Victor Halston slammed the deed onto the table hard enough to rattle the coffee cups, and every man in that room went quiet. "Sign it," he said. Not asked, said. The way a man speaks when he's already decided the answer. Ranch foreman's hands were shaking. Not from age. From rage. From the particular kind of helplessness that comes when a powerful man walks into a room and reminds you that the law bends toward money, not toward what's right. Holston leaned in close. "You've got 48 hours before I own every acre of Blackthorn Ridge. Every head of cattle, every nail in every fence post." He smiled, then slow, satisfied, the smile of a man who had already won. "Or you can make this easy on everyone and sign right now." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because what do you say to a man like that? What do you do when everything your family spent 30 years building is about to be taken by someone who never once lifted a hand to earn it? If that were you sitting at that table, your name on that deed, your livelihood on that paper, what would you do? That moment is where this story truly begins. Not at the end, not at the celebration, but in that suffocating room, with a man's pen hovering over a document that would erase everything. Before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to you, if you believe that courage still matters, and that the truth has a way of surviving even when it seems buried, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button. Leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. And stay with me until the very last word, because what happens next is something you won't see coming. Name on the deed was Blackthorn Ridge Ranch, and it had been bleeding out slowly for the better part of 2 years. Cattle numbers told one story. The account books told another. And the people who worked those acres, the ones who got up before sunrise and came in after dark, with their boots caked in mud and their backs aching from honest labor, they told a third story. Entirely, one that didn't match either of the first two. Discrepancy was the thing that kept Nathan Cole awake at night. He had reviewed the ledgers 3 times, had cross-referenced the cattle tallies against the supply invoices, the water usage logs, the payroll records. Something was wrong. Not wrong in the way ranches go wrong from drought or bad luck or mismanagement. Wrong in the deliberate, calculated way that only happens when someone is steering a ship toward the rocks on purpose. But financial reports only told you so much. Numbers could be cleaned. Paperwork could be adjusted. What you couldn't fake was what you'd see if you actually walked into that place and watched how people moved, how they talked to each other, whether they looked a stranger in the eye or found somewhere else to look. Nathan had made his fortune by trusting what he saw with his own eyes over what any accountant put in front of him. That instinct had never let him down. So on a Tuesday morning in late October, he packed a single bag, not the leather travel case he usually carried, but an old canvas duffel that had belonged to his grandfather. He put on clothes that didn't fit particularly well, a hat with a sweat stain along the band, and boots that had seen better years. Left his good watch on the dresser. Left his name with his lawyer and no one else. And he rode into Blackthorn Ridge, looking like a man who needed the work. Ranch appeared at the end of a long dirt road, flanked by scrub brush and low hills that turned amber in the morning light. Fence posts along the drive were mostly straight, but not entirely. A few leaned like tired men, the wire between them sagging in places that suggested repair work done in a hurry, or not done at all. Main barn was solid enough, the timber weathered but not rotted. Bunkhouse sat off to the left, smoke coming from the chimney even in the mild air, which meant the stove inside was faulty, or the men were cold, or both. Nathan took all of this in without appearing to look at any of it. A man came out from the barn before Nathan even climbed down from his horse. Medium height, stocky through the shoulders, with the kind of permanent squint you develop from years of reading the horizon. Stopped about 10 feet away and crossed his arms. "You're not from around here," the man said. It wasn't a question. "No, sir," Nathan said. "Heard you might be taking on hands." Man looked him over the way you'd assess a horse you weren't planning on buying. "Where'd you hear that?" "Town. Saloon, specifically." Fella named Briggs mentioned it. The man's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes the name had landed. "Briggs talks too much. My name's Mercer. Cole Mercer. I run the day operations here." He paused. "What do you know about cattle?" Nathan had spent 12 years managing 4 separate ranching operations across 2 territories. He had negotiated water rights contracts that took teams of lawyers 3 months to draft. He understood cattle the way most men understood their own hands. "Enough," he said. Mercer looked at him for another few seconds. "That's not an answer. It's the most honest one I've got." Something about that seemed to satisfy Mercer. or at least not actively dissatisfy him. Run crossed his arms. We're not offering much in wages. Room, board, and what we can spare at the end of the month. That works for you. You start tomorrow morning. Works fine, Nathan said. He unsaddled his horse himself and found an empty stall without asking where to look. That detail, the fact that he didn't need to be told, went into the mental ledger Nathan was already keeping. Bunkhouse held 7 men, and they received Nathan the way ranch crews always received strangers, with a minimal acknowledgement that suggested they were reserving judgment. A few nodded. One didn't look up from the harness he was mending. Youngest one, who couldn't have been more than 19, asked Nathan where he was from and seemed mildly disappointed by the non-specific answer. Man in the far corner was the one Nathan paid attention to. His name was Grayson Vale, and Nathan knew it before anyone told him, because the way a man sits in a room tells you something about how he thinks of himself in relation to everyone else in it. Vale sat like he owned the corner, not aggressive about it, not loud, but settled in a way that said he'd decided his position here long ago and wasn't planning to renegotiate. He was perhaps 40, lean, with a neatly trimmed beard that seemed slightly out of place among men who shaved when they got around to it. He acknowledged Nathan with a nod, and then went back to whatever he'd been doing, which appeared to be nothing in particular. Studied quality of that idleness was interesting. Nathan took the empty bunk nearest the door, always take the exit, and stretched out with his boots still on, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the bunkhouse settle around him. The first week at Blackthorn Ridge taught Nathan several things he hadn't expected. The work was harder than the financials suggested it should be. Not because the men were lazy, they weren't, but because they were consistently working around problems that should have been fixed months ago. A water pump that ran rough and took 2 men to prime when it should have taken 1. Fence sections that had been patched with the wrong gauge wire, which meant they'd hold for now but would fail under pressure. Saddles that needed recondition, bridles that needed replacing, a grain storage situation that was inviting rodents, and everyone knew it, but nobody had addressed. Nathan fixed the grain situation on his 3rd day without being asked. Reorganized the storage, patched 2 gaps in the floor of the storage room, and relocated the bags in a way that cut access points for anything with 4 legs and a taste for feed. He didn't make a production of it. He just did it. Mercer noticed. Nathan watched him notice and say nothing, which was its own form of acknowledgement. Bigger revelation was the cattle count. Nathan went out with the morning crew on his 4th day, and he counted as he rode. He had a head for numbers, the way some men have a head for directions naturally, without effort, the way water finds its level. What he counted didn't match what was in the inventory reports he'd reviewed from a distance. The discrepancy was small enough that it might have been rounding error. Might have been the natural fluctuation of a working herd. But Nathan had been in this business long enough to know the difference between the irregularity of nature and the irregularity of intention. Said nothing. He filed it away and kept counting. She arrived on a Friday afternoon in a wagon she'd clearly negotiated her own passage on, sitting in the back among sacks of flour and a crate of something that clucked periodically with mild irritation. Nathan was mending a section of corral fence when the wagon came in, and he had a clear sightline to the yard. He watched her climb down without waiting for help, straighten her skirt with a single efficient motion, and pick up her bag before the driver had finished setting the brake. Her name, he'd learned, was Evelyn Hartwell. She was perhaps 35, though she carried herself with a particular kind of stillness that made age seem like a category she'd decided not to participate in. Her hair was dark and pulled back practically rather than decoratively. Coat was good quality but old. Kind of good quality, but old that tells you the person wearing it has had money before, and has since learned to live without it, and is neither ashamed nor resentful of either fact. She walked toward the house, and the one who met her at the door was Margaret Voss, the ranch's housekeeper, a woman of 60, who ran the domestic operations of Blackthorn Ridge with the kind of authority that didn't require raising her voice. Nathan went back to the fence. But he was aware of the new arrival the way you're aware of a change in weather, not intrusive, just present, the kind of shift in atmosphere that changes the quality of the air. By dinner, he knew more. The crew ate together in the main house, at a long table that had been built for a larger operation and now had gaps on the bench like missing teeth. Evelyn had taken over the kitchen that afternoon, with zero announcement, and what came out of it was markedly different from what had been coming out of it the week prior. Not dramatically different, not restaurant different. Biscuits were right. The gravy had been seasoned by someone who understood seasoning, and the coffee tasted like coffee instead of regret. Men who have been eating bad food for months respond to good food with a kind of stunned appreciation that's almost embarrassing in its sincerity. C. There was a moment when the biscuit basket hit the table and 3 different men reached for it simultaneously, and then all 3 stopped and looked at each other and started laughing. Something in the room relaxed that Nathan hadn't even realized was tense. Evelyn came out from the kitchen once to replenish the bread, and once because one of the younger hands stuck his head in and asked if there was more of the gravy. She answered both visits with the same matter-of-fact efficiency, not chatting, not performing warmth, just doing what the moment called for and returning to her work. Grayson Vale, Nathan noticed, barely touched his food. He was watching the room instead, the way Nathan was watching the room, and that parallel made Nathan quietly uneasy. Second week, Nathan started asking questions. Not pointed questions. Not the kind of questions that make people stop and wonder why you're asking. Ask the questions that fit naturally into work conversation, the kind a new hand might ask while getting a feel for how a ranch runs. How long have you been here? What happened to the east pasture? I noticed the water table seemed low when we rode that section. Has that been a problem long? Men answered the way. Men answer when they're used to a particular reality and no longer think about whether it's normal. East pasture had been pulled out of rotation 8 months ago. The water table situation had developed over the summer. Cattle count had been adjusted 3 times in the last year because of losses that the men described with a vagueness that suggested they'd been told not to ask too many questions about. Nathan kept his face neutral and filed every word. He was also, without planning for it, talking to Evelyn. Not in any significant way at first. She was in the kitchen and he was occasionally passing through, and it started the way those conversations always start with the mundane. She asked him to hand her a jar on a high shelf. He mentioned that the stove's left burner was running hot. She said she'd noticed and had already shimmed the grate to compensate. How'd you figure that out? He asked. Touched it, she said. You can feel which side's hotter if you hold your hand close. Not on the cast iron above it. Takes about 30 seconds. Such a straightforward, practical answer. No performance. No explanation of why she knew it or how long it had taken her to figure it out. Just the information, offered like a tool rather than a credential. Nathan found himself thinking about that later, when he was alone. The way some people use knowledge to establish territory, and some people use it to solve problems. It was a distinction he cared about more than he cared about most things. On the 15th day, everything shifted. He was in the barn before sunrise, checking on one of the mares who had been favoring her left foreleg. The lamp was turned low. He wasn't expecting anyone. The side door opened and Grayson Vale came in. He didn't see Nathan at first. Nathan was in the back stall, partially concealed by shadow and a hay partition. Vale moved directly to the tack room, which was where the ranch's secondary records were kept. Not the main books, which were in the house, but the daily work logs, cattle movement sheets, grazing rotation notes. He was in there for perhaps 4 minutes. He came out with something folded in his inside coat pocket, though he'd gone in empty-handed, left without looking around. Nathan stayed very still for a long moment after the side door closed. Then he went into the tack room and checked the record shelf. Daily movement log for the previous week was gone. Cattle count sheet from 2 weeks prior was also missing. He stood there in the dim lamplight and breathed slowly and thought about what that meant, and what it meant was worse than he'd initially suspected. Someone wasn't just skimming money off the top of Blackthorn Ridge. Someone was systematically dismantling its documentation. He found Evelyn in the kitchen earlier than usual the next morning, earlier than she should have been there, which meant she'd been there even earlier than that. She had the pantry inventory spread across the work table, and she was cross-referencing it against a separate handwritten list she'd clearly made herself. "Here early," Nathan said. "Supply numbers don't add up," she said, without looking up. 3rd week running. He came closer. He looked at her list without touching it. What kind of discrepancy? Small enough that you wouldn't catch it if you weren't looking for it. She did look up then, and her eyes were direct in a way that told him she'd been thinking about something beyond the numbers. "But I'm always looking for it." "Why? Because that's how it starts," she said simply. Small enough to dismiss. Then suddenly it isn't small anymore. Nathan stood there, looking at her for a moment. She was watching him back with an expression that wasn't quite suspicion, but was adjacent to it, the particular alertness of someone who has learned. through experience rather than personality, not to take people at face value. What were you doing before this? He asked. Managing a supply operation for a mining company. She paused, until the owner decided the operation didn't need managing anymore. What happened to it? It disappeared, she said. Same way operations disappear when someone drains them long enough. From the inside. The word inside hung in the air between them. Nathan said, "Let me see the list." She hesitated genuinely, meaningfully, the hesitation of someone who has handed things to people before and had it go wrong. Turned the paper toward him. The numbers were clear. Feed supply down in a pattern inconsistent with actual usage. Small equipment, not large items. Nothing that would be obviously missed. But tools, parts, kinds of things that disappeared gradually enough that you'd chalk each one up to misplacement or wear gone at a rate that was statistically unlikely if the cause was simply carelessness. Nathan studied the list for 2 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "You didn't show this to Mercer." "Not yet." "Why not?" She took the list back. "Because I wanted to understand it better before I said anything to anyone." She met his eyes. "Because I don't know yet who I can trust." Nathan held her gaze and thought, "Neither do I." What he said was, "That's probably smart." He left the kitchen with the particular weight of a man who is carrying more than he's showing. He knew with the certainty that comes from years of reading situations correctly that the thing he'd ridden into Blackthorn Ridge to evaluate had turned out to be something considerably more dangerous than a struggling ranch. Someone was engineering the death of this place from the inside. Question now was not whether Nathan had the resources to stop it. He did. He absolutely did. Question was whether he could stop it in time, and whether, by the time it was over, people who had earned his trust would still be willing to extend theirs. Once they found out what he'd been holding back from the moment he rode through those gates. He lay in the bunkhouse that night, listening to the breathing of sleeping men, and thought about Victor Halston. Halston had been circling Blackthorn Ridge for 8 months. At minimum, that was the earliest record of his name appearing in connection with offers for the land. The offers had come in low, been declined, come back lower, been declined again. Then the ranch's financial problems had started accelerating. That acceleration had followed a pattern, not the random pattern of bad luck, not the irregular pattern of mismanagement. A steady, deliberate pattern, the kind you get when someone with intelligent patience decides to create a crisis rather than wait for one. Nathan had suspected it from the outside. From the inside, he was increasingly certain of it. The question that had no clear answer yet was how deeply into the ranch's operations Halston's influence ran. To create this kind of sustained, document-supported crisis, you needed someone on the inside, someone with access, someone trusted enough to move freely without raising suspicion. Nathan turned his head and looked at the corner where Grace and Vale slept. Vale's breathing was slow and even. He looked in the darkness like any other tired man at the end of a long day's work. Nathan had been wrong about people before. Not often, but enough to know that certainty was a luxury. He needed more than circumstantial evidence. He needed to see the mechanism, not just the damage it was causing. Closed his eyes. Tomorrow he would find a way to get a look at the main account books. And he would do it as Nathan Cole, ranch hand, because the moment he stopped being Nathan Cole, ranch hand, became who he actually was. Everything would change. Information would stop flowing. The people around him would start performing instead of living. And whatever was being hidden would go underground somewhere he couldn't reach it. For now, the most powerful thing he possessed was the fact that no one in Blackthorn Ridge had any idea how much power he actually held. He intended to keep it that way, for a little while longer. He found the main account books on a Wednesday, not because anyone showed him where they were, because he'd spent 3 weeks paying attention to which door Mercer came out of when he looked troubled. And the answer was always the small office off the back of the main house, the room with the frosted window, and the latch that stuck unless you lifted the handle slightly while you turned it. Nathan had noticed the latch on his second day, the way he noticed everything, the way a man notices details when his livelihood has depended on noticing them for long enough that it stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like breathing. He got into the office on a Wednesday afternoon when Mercer was out riding the north fence line with 2 of the crew and the house was quiet. Didn't break anything. He didn't force anything. Simply lifted the handle slightly and turned, the way the door wanted to be opened, and went inside. Books were on the shelf above the desk, organized by year, and Nathan pulled the most recent 2 without touching anything else. Stood at the desk and read quickly, because he'd taught himself years ago to read ledgers, fast not skimming, but genuinely processing, numbers becoming a kind of language he could speak fluently. What he saw in those books was worse than his estimates. The operating losses were real, that part hadn't been fabricated. But layered beneath them, in the adjustments and the footnotes, and the small entries that a tired man reviewing books at the end of a long day might gloss over, were a series of corrections, inventory adjustments, cattle count revisions, write-downs attributed to causes that were technically plausible individually but statistically improbable in aggregate. Taken together, they told a story of systematic hemorrhage. Not dramatic, not obvious. The financial equivalent of a slow leak, the kind that doesn't announce itself until the vessel is already half empty. Nathan put the books back exactly where he'd found them. He went back outside and picked up the fence pliers he'd left by the corral and went back to work, and his hands were steady, and his face gave nothing away. Inside, he was recalculating everything. The problem with knowing something and being unable to act on it directly is that the knowledge sits in your chest like a stone. You carry it through every ordinary moment of the day, through meals and work and conversation, and it presses against your ribs with every breath, reminding you that things are worse than they appear. Not that the people around you don't know yet how bad it is, and that you are, in some sense, complicit in their not knowing. Nathan had made a choice when he rode into Blackthorn Ridge. He understood the terms of that choice. It didn't make the carrying any lighter. What made it heavier specifically was Evelyn. She had started finding things. Small things, ways she found things methodically, without drama, following the thread of an irregularity until it led somewhere. The supply discrepancies she'd identified in the kitchen had turned out to be connected to a broader pattern she'd traced through the household purchasing records, which she'd apparently requested from Mercer under the reasonable pretext of needing to plan provisioning more efficiently. Mercer had given them to her because Mercer was the kind of man who respected competence in whatever form it arrived, even when it arrived wearing a cook's apron. She found Nathan on a Thursday evening near the water trough at the far end of the South Corral, far enough from the bunkhouse that voices didn't carry, and she stood beside him and looked at the darkening hills and said, without preamble, "There's a vendor on the supply invoices that I can't verify." Nathan kept his eyes on the hills. "What do you mean you can't verify?" "I mean, there's no such business. I asked the supply driver about it when he came through today. Said he'd never heard of them. He's been servicing this ranch for 6 years. She paused. Invoices go back 14 months. The stone in Nathan's chest shifted. How much over that period? Close to $4,000. Neither of them said anything for a moment. You find this in the purchasing records Mercer gave you? Nathan asked. Yes. Which means either Mercer doesn't look at his own purchasing records carefully enough, or she stopped. Nah, or he doesn't look at them because he doesn't want to see what's there, Nathan finished. I'm not accusing him, she said quickly. I genuinely don't know which it is. Neither do I. She turned her head and looked at him. He felt that look the way you feel a hand on your shoulder, not unpleasant, but grounding, kind of contact that reminds you that you're solid and present and accountable to the moment. Not surprised, she said. No, that's interesting. Her voice was careful, not accusatory, but alert in a way that made Nathan aware she was assembling something in her mind, piece by piece, and that the piece she was currently fitting into place had his shape. Most men, when you tell them you found evidence of fraud in the operation they're working for, look surprised. Even if they're not. Maybe I've seen it before, Nathan said. Maybe, she said. And then she looked back at the hills, and she didn't push further, and he wasn't sure if that was because she was giving him space or because she was giving him rope. Suspected it was the latter. The next day, Halston came to the ranch. He arrived in a black buggy that was expensive enough to be a statement and pulled up to the main house like a man who considered parking a political act. He was perhaps 55, broad through the chest, with silver hair and the particular kind of groomed, composed face that suggests a man has spent significant effort ensuring that nothing he feels ever shows unless he wants it to. Wore a dark coat despite the mild afternoon, which Nathan read as the sartorial equivalent of a drawn weapon, a reminder that this visit was formal, which meant it was serious. Mercer met him on the porch. Nathan was working the near corral, close enough to observe, far enough to appear uninterested. Kept his movements slow and regular, and watched from under the brim of his hat. Holston and Mercer spoke for perhaps 10 minutes. Nathan couldn't hear the words, but he could read the posture well enough. Holston was doing most of the talking. Mercer was doing the listening. That means you're trying to figure out what you're allowed to say back. At one point, Halston produced a document from his coat, folded official-looking, and held it at an angle that forced Mercer to reach for it rather than having it handed over. That detail was deliberate. Nathan had seen men use that particular move before, and it always meant the same thing. I want you to understand that you're asking me for something, even when I'm the one offering. Mercer read the document. He read it twice. His shoulders did something complicated. Halston watched him read with an expression of patient pleasantness that was about as warm as the inside of a mine shaft. Then Mercer handed it back and said something short, and Halston smiled that particular smile Nathan had seen in the opening moments of this story. The one that lived in the territory between confidence and contempt, and put the document back in his coat and said something else, and Mercer's jaw tightened in a way you could see from 20 yards. Halston got back into his buggy and left with the same deliberate unhurry with which he'd arrived. Mercer stood on the porch for a moment. Then he walked into the house and shut the door harder than the situation called for. Nathan kept working the corral. His hands were steady. His mind was not. That evening Mercer called a meeting. Not a formal one, there was no table, no gathering in the main room. He simply appeared in the bunkhouse doorway after dinner and said, "I need a few minutes," in a tone that brought the room to attention the way a particular quality of quiet does. He told them that Halston had made another offer. He told them the terms, which were, by any reasonable measure, worse than the last set of terms. He told them that the offer came with a deadline 48 hours, and that declining it would likely trigger a legal process that Halston's lawyers had been preparing for some time. He told them all of this without telling them everything, which is to say, he gave them the facts and none of his own feeling about the facts. Dee and Nathan understood that this was not because Mercer was cold, but because Mercer was the kind of man who considered showing his hand to be a form of weakness, and who had learned that lesson in a context where it was probably correct, and hadn't yet figured out that the lesson had an expiration date. The room was quiet for a moment after Mercer finished. Then the youngest hand, the 19-year-old, Danny, who'd asked Nathan where he was from on his first night, said, "So what do we do?" Mercer looked at him. "That's what I'm working on figuring out." "We can't just let him take it," Danny said. The directness of youth, Nathan thought the kind of clarity you have before the world teaches you how complicated problems actually are. "Nobody said anything about letting him take it," Mercer said. "Then what are you saying?" Mercer was quiet for a beat longer than he should have been, which is its own kind of answer. "I'm saying I need you all to know what we're up against." He looked around the room. "That's all I'm saying tonight." He left. The room started talking. Nathan lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling and listened to the conversation unspool around him. The anger, the fear dressed as anger, the bravado that was a third layer over both, and he thought about what Mercer hadn't said. He hadn't said what was in the document Halston had shown him. Whatever was in that document was the real shape of the threat. Mercer was carrying it alone. And that, more than anything Halston had done or said, told Nathan that the situation had moved into a new and more dangerous phase. He found Grayson Vale behind the barn that same night. Not deliberately, he'd gone out to check on the mare with the foreleg problem, and Vale was there, standing in the narrow passage between the back wall of the barn and the fence line, in the dark, which was not a place a man went at that hour unless he was avoiding the light. Vale heard him coming and didn't startle, which meant he'd heard Nathan earlier than Nathan had heard himself. That level of ambient awareness was its own information. "She favoring that leg again?" Vale asked, nodding toward the barn. "Checking," Nathan said. He leaned against the fence. "You hear Mercer tonight?" "I heard. What do you think?" Vale was quiet for a moment. He had a way of being quiet that felt considered rather than empty. "I think Halston's been patient because he could afford to be patient," he said finally. "Patience is a strategy, not a virtue." Nathan looked at him. "That's an interesting way to put it. It's an accurate way to put it." Vale's voice was flat, uninflected. "Powerful men don't wait because they're nice. They wait because they're building something they don't want you to see until it's finished." The hair on Nathan's arms lifted, very slightly. Because the thing about that statement was that it was entirely true, and the man who said it was either perceptive or speaking from knowledge, and Nathan needed to know which. "Seen that kind of thing before?" Nathan asked. "I've been around long enough to see a few things." Vale pushed off from the fence. "Night," he said, and went back inside. Nathan stood in the dark behind the barn for a while longer. Mare was fine. The foreleg had just been cold. She didn't need him at all, but he stayed there anyway, thinking about the way Vale had described patience as strategy, and whether a man said something like that because he understood it from the outside or from the inside. Lippy, and what the difference meant for everyone sleeping in that bunkhouse. Evelyn had been given a small room off the kitchen, not much more than a closet with a window, but she'd organized it with the same efficient practicality she brought to everything. And when Nathan knocked on the door frame the following morning, before the rest of the house was awake, it was clear she'd been up for at least an hour. She was writing at the small table by the window, actual writing a list of some kind, columns of figures. She turned the paper over when he appeared, which he noted and didn't comment on. Vendor, he said. The fake one. Did you write down the name? Meridian Supply Company, she said. Invoices signed by someone named E. Graves. No address? A post office box in a town called Cutter's Mill, about 40 miles east. She paused. Asked around quietly. Cutter's Mill's real. I don't know about the post office box. Nathan turned the name over in his mind. Meridian Supply. E. Graves. The deliberate non-specificity of a fabrication that needed to be convincing enough to pass a cursory review, without being specific enough to invite investigation. I've been busy, he said. The alternative is to wait for someone else to handle it, she said. I tried that once. The operation I mentioned, the mining company, I saw the signs early. I thought someone with more authority than me would see them too and do something. She picked up her pen and set it back down without writing anything. Did see them. They just didn't do anything until there was nothing left to do anything about. Nathan sat down on the edge of the chair across from her, uninvited, and she didn't object. Who had the authority at that company? He asked. Owner's representative, a man named Calder. Her voice was even. Turned out to be the one running the scheme. By the time anyone understood that, the operation had lost everything worth losing. And you? I walked away before the collapse. Barely. She looked at him steadily. I'd learned enough to recognize the shape of it, and I swore I'd recognize it faster next time. Recognized it here fast enough. Yes, she said. Recognizing it and being able to stop it are different problems. Nathan looked at the turned-over paper on the table. What else is on that list? She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned the paper back over and pushed it toward him. List was longer than he'd expected. Dates, amounts, vendor names, 3 of them. Not just Meridian Supply, all with the same characteristics. P. Go. Box addresses. Unverifiable names. Amount small enough individually to avoid scrutiny. Devastating in aggregate. She'd tracked the payment timing against the cattle count revisions and found a correlation that was too precise to be accidental. Money went out on a regular schedule. Cattle numbers were revised downward in the same general window. Books were adjusted to absorb both. It was clean, organized, and very nearly invisible. Took you how long? Nathan asked. 3 weeks, she said. Give or take. While cooking 3 meals a day. Food doesn't take as long as people think, she said. If you know what you're doing. Nathan looked at the list for another long moment. He was acutely aware that he was sitting across from a woman who had uncovered, through intelligence and determination and a refusal to mind her own business in the best possible sense, most of what he'd come here to find, and that she had done it while he was still being careful, still managing his exposure, still protecting his position. He was also aware that she was looking at him with that particular alertness again, one that said she was assembling a picture and that the picture was getting clearer. You know something, she said. Not an accusation. A statement of what she'd concluded. I know several things, Nathan said. More than a hired hand should, yes. She held his gaze. Are you going to tell me what you actually are? The question sat in the air between them. Nathan thought about all the reasons to say not yet. Reasons were real, practical, operational, legitimate. Wrong information in the wrong moment could change how people behaved in ways that would make stopping this harder, not easier. Evelyn Hartwell had just handed him 3 weeks of careful, dangerous, meticulous work on a piece of paper. She'd done it with her eyes open. She deserved something more than another layer of deflection. Today, he said, but soon, and when I do, I need you to hear it the right way. Right way, she repeated. Not as a betrayal, he said. An explanation. She looked at him for a long moment. Could see her deciding whether to push. She was the kind of person who could push effectively when she chose to. The pressure she'd apply would be precise and uncomfortable, and almost certainly productive, and she knew it. She chose not to. Instead, she took the paper back and turned it over again and said, soon had better be actually soon. It will be, he said. He left the kitchen and went back into the cold morning air and stood outside for a minute with his breath making small clouds in front of him. He felt something he hadn't expected to feel when he'd ridden into Blackthorn Ridge, not the satisfaction of gathering intelligence, not the forward momentum of a plan assembling itself, but something more personal and less comfortable, something closer to guilt. He didn't particularly like the feeling. He respected it enough not to push it away. On the 22nd day, he found the missing cattle. Not all of them, but 23 head that had been written off as losses in the September revision, attributed to drought and disease, showing up in a box canyon about 6 miles north of the ranch's declared boundary. Canyon wasn't on any of Blackthorn Ridge's official maps. It was the kind of place you'd know about if you'd ridden this land for years. Kind of place that would be very useful if you needed to hold cattle temporarily, out of sight, while you arranged for their sale elsewhere. Nathan found them on a solo ride he'd requested permission for under the pretext of checking the north water sources. Mercer had agreed without enthusiasm, which was how Mercer agreed to most things that weren't his idea. Counted them twice, 23, all branded, all Blackthorn Ridge stock. Didn't move them. He didn't touch anything. He rode back to the ranch in the early afternoon and went to work in the corral and said nothing to anyone, because he needed to understand one more piece before he could act. He needed to know the mechanism of their removal, how they'd gotten there, who'd moved them, what the next step in the plan was. Stopping the scheme at this stage without understanding the full architecture would be like cutting one strand of a net, temporarily disruptive, ultimately insufficient. He needed to see the net whole. Gediyi. The letter arrived the following morning, and Mercer brought it to the breakfast table with the energy of a man who had just been handed something that complicated everything he'd already thought was complicated enough. Didn't read it aloud. Put it in his shirt pocket and told the crew the morning assignments and sent everyone to their work. And then he found Nathan in the corral, specifically Nathan, which meant something, and said, "Can I talk to you for a minute?" It wasn't a question. They walked to the far end of the corral, away from the others, and Mercer took the letter out and held it without offering it. Halston's lawyers have filed a notice of default against the ranch's operating debt. The 48 hours he talked about wasn't an offer deadline. Courtesy notice. Nathan looked at him. When does it become actionable? 30 days from yesterday. Mercer folded the letter and put it back in his pocket. He was looking at the fence line rather than at Nathan. Debt is real. I won't pretend otherwise. We've been carrying it for 2 years and it's gotten worse, not better. But the rate it's gotten worse at doesn't make sense to me. I'm not a financial genius, but I'm not an idiot either. Something about the way the numbers moved feels wrong. It is wrong, Nathan said. Mercer's head turned. The look he gave Nathan was long and level and contained a question he was assembling from several smaller questions. I've been watching the books, Nathan said, before Mercer could ask the larger one. Supply invoices, and the cattle count, and there are things in all three that don't match. Kind of things. The kind that suggests someone has been redirecting resources away from this ranch for at least a year, possibly longer. Not dramatically, carefully. The kind of careful that's designed to look like normal operational loss. Mercer was very still. You're saying someone here? I'm saying I think so. The silence that followed had texture to it. Nathan watched Mercer work through the implications. And he could see the moment when Mercer arrived at the specific implication, the one that involved looking at the men he'd worked beside every day and trying to fit that knowledge over their faces. You know who, Mercer said. I have a suspicion, Nathan said. I need more before I'm certain. How much more? A few days. Mercer looked at him with an expression that had moved past the early wariness into something more complicated. Who are you? He asked. And I mean that seriously. 'Cause you are not what you walked in here looking like. Nathan held his gaze. No, he said, I'm not. Then what are you? Someone who wants this ranch to survive, Nathan said. That part is completely true. Mercer studied him. The study took a while. Then he said, a few days in a tone that meant both I'm giving you this and I need this to mean something. Thank you, Nathan said. Mercer walked away without answering, which Nathan understood to mean, don't make me regret it. Few days compressed into 2 when Grayson Vale made a mistake. It was a small mistake, the kind that only looks small until you understand what it means. He told Danny, the youngest hand, to take the supply wagon to Cutter's Mill the following morning to pick up an order. This would have been unremarkable except that no supply order had been discussed at the previous week's provisioning meeting, and the ranch's official supply run wasn't scheduled for another 10 days. Ran the route to Cutter's Mill, passed within a mile of the Box Canyon, where Nathan had found the missing cattle. Nathan heard this from Danny himself, who mentioned it casually at dinner without any idea that it meant anything. Nathan ate the rest of his meal slowly and didn't look at Vale. After dinner, he went to Evelyn. She was washing up in the kitchen, and she read his face before he said a word and dried her hands on a cloth and waited. "I need you to do something tomorrow morning," he said. "I need you to understand why without me explaining all of it. I'll decide whether I can do that after you ask," she said. "I need you to find a reason to delay the supply run. Something that holds up the wagon for at least 2 hours. Long enough for me to get to the North Canyon and back." She looked at him. "The North Canyon, yes. Something to do with the missing cattle." "Yes." She folded the cloth and set it on the counter with a precision that suggested she was taking a moment to think rather than a moment to hesitate. Then she said, "The wagon's left front axle pin looked loose to me this afternoon. I noticed it when I was coming back from the root cellar. Is that true?" "It is now," she said. "B. I'll notice it loudly in the morning, and it'll take most of the morning to find a replacement pin in the tool stores because I'm going to misplace the obvious one tonight." He looked at her for a moment. "You're remarkably good at this." "I'm remarkably good at solving problems," she said. "This is a problem. Go find what you need to find." He was almost to the door when she said, "Behind him, Nathan." Turned. "Whatever you are," she said quietly. "Be careful with it. These men—" She stopped, collected herself. "These men have worked this land for years. Some of them have nowhere else to go. What happens here matters to them in ways that go beyond wages." She met his eyes across the kitchen. "I'm asking you to remember that when you decide what to do next." Nathan stood in the doorway and felt the full weight of what she'd just said land in the center of his chest and stay there. "I remember it every hour," he said. He walked out into the dark and stood under the open sky and breathed the cold night air and understood, with a clarity he hadn't anticipated when he'd packed that canvas duffel bag and ridden into Blackthorn Ridge looking like nobody, that the decision he made in the next few days would define not just the future of this ranch, but the kind of man he was deciding once and for all to be. Kind who protected things from a distance, through documents and legal authority, and the clean, bloodless mechanics of power. Kind who stayed. He had enough information now to make a move. The scheme was clear. The actors were identified. The mechanism was in his reach. He knew what he had to do. The harder question, the one that kept him standing under that dark sky longer than he needed to, was whether he was prepared for everything that would change the moment he stopped being a hired hand, named Nathan Cole, and became what he actually was. Because once that happened, there was no going back. Beyond everything and everyone he'd come to know in these 23 days, Mercer's guarded respect, Danny's uncomplicated goodwill, and Evelyn, specifically Evelyn, who had trusted him with a piece of paper full of 3 weeks of careful, dangerous work. All of it would have to survive the truth of who had been standing among them all along. He was not certain it would. He went to bed without deciding. Woke up at first light, having decided. He rode out before the wagon was hitched. Morning was cold in the particular way that October mornings are cold on high ground, not bitter yet, not the kind of cold that gets into your joints and stays, but enough to make your breath visible and your fingers slow until you've been moving for 20 minutes. Nathan saddled his horse in the dark, working by feel, and a low lamp he kept shuttered so it threw minimal light through the barn door, and he was on the north trail before the main house showed any sign of life. Rode at a pace that covered ground without announcing itself. Not slow, not hard, the pace of a man who knows where he's going and doesn't want anyone to notice he's going there. Box Canyon was exactly as he'd left it 6 days prior. Cattle were still there, 23 head, settled into a routine of confinement, the way cattle do when they've been somewhere long enough to stop being agitated about it. They'd been watered recently. The trampled ground near the canyon's narrow water seep was fresh enough that Nathan could tell it had been tended within the last 48 hours, which meant someone had been out here quietly maintaining the situation while the rest of the ranch operated in apparent crisis. Dismounted and walked the perimeter of the canyon on foot. Wasn't looking at the cattle anymore. He was looking at the ground around them, specifically the tracks. There were horse tracks coming in from the southeast, following a route that skirted the edge of Blackthorn Ridge's surveyed land without crossing it, which told him whoever made them understood property boundaries well enough to move along their edge deliberately. There was a second set of tracks, newer, coming from a different angle, west. Those tracks didn't belong to the same horse, the gait pattern was different. the depth in the soft ground suggesting a lighter animal or a lighter rider. 2 people then, not one. Nathan stood in the canyon, with the cattle moving around him with mild bovine indifference. He thought about what 2 sets of tracks meant, and the conclusion he reached was not a comfortable one, because it meant that Vale was not operating alone, and if Vale was not operating alone, the question of who the second person was opened up a range of possibilities that included people Nathan had not yet considered and should have. He photographed the tracks in his memory the way he'd learned to do over years of field work, noting the details that mattered: depth, direction, spacing, and he rode back at the same measured pace he'd arrived at, his mind working through the implications, sorting them into what he knew, what he suspected, and what he still needed to see. Evelyn had performed admirably. When Nathan returned to the ranch yard, the supply wagon was still sitting exactly where it had been at dawn, its left front axle propped on a block of wood, while Danny and another hand named Prescott crouched in the dirt beside it, baiting the replacement of a pin that had apparently defied immediate location in the tool stores. Evelyn was standing near the wagon with her arms crossed, wearing the expression of a woman who has identified a problem and is patiently waiting for the men addressing it to make adequate progress. She didn't look at Nathan when he rode in. He put his horse up and went about his morning as if he'd simply been checking water sources, which was the story he'd left behind him, and it held without question, because nobody particularly tracks a hired hand's whereabouts when there's a broken wagon pin to deal with. Caught Evelyn's eye once, briefly, when he passed the wagon on his way to the corral. She gave him nothing visible, no raised eyebrow, no small nod, just the same composed expression. But she shifted her weight slightly, which in the language they'd developed without ever discussing it meant, well? He let his eyes settle on her for 1 extra second, which meant something significant. Then he kept walking. Found a reason to be near the main house around mid-morning, and he was outside the frosted office window when he heard Mercer inside. On the telephone, the ranch's one telephone connection, the line that ran into town and was reliable roughly 60% of the time. Could hear Mercer's voice through the glass, not clearly, but enough to understand that Mercer was talking to a lawyer. Word default came through the glass. So did the word 30 days. Then, distinctly, the phrase, "I don't think the losses are real." Nathan felt something shift in his assessment of Cole Mercer. Man had said almost nothing to Nathan since their conversation at the corral fence, given no sign of having acted on what Nathan told him, or of having arrived at any conclusions of his own. Nathan had taken that silence for caution, maybe for doubt, the kind of deliberate suspension of judgment that experienced men practice when they're not ready to move. Mercer had been talking to a lawyer. He'd been saying he didn't think the losses were real. Been moving, just quietly. Nathan filed this away with the complex feeling of someone who has underestimated a person he was already trying to respect. The wagon finally left for Cutter's Mill at midday, 2.5 hours behind schedule, with Danny driving and Prescott riding alongside because Prescott had mentioned an errand of his own in town and Danny hadn't objected to the company. Grayson Vale was not on the wagon. Nathan had expected him to find a reason to be on the wagon to accompany it, to redirect it, to make the journey himself under some plausible pretext. Instead, Vale spent the morning doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing, which was repairing a section of east fence with 2 other men, in full view of anyone who looked, unremarkable in every visible way. This told Nathan that Vale wasn't going to the canyon today, which meant Vale knew, somehow, that the timing was off. Meant Vale had better situational awareness than Nathan had credited him for, or Vale had been informed by someone that the wagon was delayed. Nathan didn't like either conclusion. He spent the afternoon thinking about the northwest tracks. 4 o'clock, walked into the main house and knocked on the office door and said, when Mercer opened it, "I need to show you something." "Not here. Can you ride tomorrow morning?" Mercer looked at him. "What is it?" "I'd rather show you than describe it. Description doesn't do it justice." Mercer was quiet for a moment, reading him. "How early?" "First light." "All right," Mercer said. "Then should I bring anyone?" "Not yet," Nathan said. "Let's see it first." Mercer nodded. And Nathan turned to leave. Mercer said, "Cole." Nathan turned back. Mercer was looking at him with the expression of a man who has been patient long enough that the patience itself has started to chafe. How much longer are you going to make me wait for the rest of it?" Nathan thought about the answer, honestly, which was something he'd been doing more of lately. "1 more day," he said. "Maybe 2. I need to confirm one more thing before the whole picture makes sense." Then you'll tell me who you actually are. And then I'll tell you everything, Nathan said. Mercer looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Go on," in a tone that meant I'm still trusting you, and I'd like you to know that I know it's a choice. That night, Nathan wrote a letter. Me. He wrote it in the bunkhouse after the other men were asleep, by the low light of a lamp turned to its minimum, on paper he'd kept in the bottom of his canvas duffel since the beginning. He wrote quickly and without revision, because the contents weren't complicated. They were the direct, specific instructions of a man who understood legal mechanisms and had prepared for this possibility before he ever arrived at Blackthorn Ridge. The letter was addressed to his attorney in the territorial capital, laid out what Nathan had found, what he believed was happening, and what he needed set in motion immediately. Requested a review of the default notice and a formal challenge to its underlying documentation. Requested a search of public records in Cutter's Mill for any registered business or P.O. box holder under the names Meridian Supply Company or E. Graves. And it requested that a particular financial investigator, a man named Croft, who had worked for Nathan before and was discreet to a degree that most men only managed in theory, be sent to Blackthorn Ridge within the week. He sealed the letter and put it in his coat pocket and told himself he'd find a way to get it on the morning mail stage without going through anyone at the ranch. Then he lay back on his bunk and stared at the ceiling and listened to the bunkhouse breathe around him. And he thought about the Northwest tracks. He thought about Evelyn's paper full of careful numbers. He thought about Mercer calling a lawyer and saying he didn't think the losses were real. And he thought about Danny on that wagon heading toward Cutter's Mill with no idea what Cutter's Mill meant in the context of this story. And he thought about the moment, coming soon now, when he would stop being Nathan Cole, a hired hand, and become Nathan Cole, the man who owned the debt this ranch was drowning in. The thought had a different texture than it had 2 weeks ago. When he'd first arrived, the revelation had been a tool in his plan, a fact to be disclosed at the strategically optimal moment for maximum effect. Now it felt like something he owed people. Specifically, felt like something he owed Evelyn, who had trusted him enough to show him 3 weeks of dangerous work on a piece of paper. Gwen, who had asked him, with her eyes open, to remember that these men had nowhere else to go. He told her he remembered it every hour. That was true. What he hadn't told her was that her asking had changed the quality of his remembering. Ride to the canyon the next morning with Mercer was quieter than Nathan had expected, but not awkwardly so. Mercer was a man comfortable with silence in the way people are when they've spent decades working land that doesn't talk back, and Nathan matched his pace without filling it with words that weren't needed. When they reached the canyon and Mercer saw the cattle, he stopped his horse at the entrance and sat very still for a long moment. "September write-off," Nathan said. Mercer didn't answer immediately. He was counting. The way Nathan had counted, not because the count would surprise him, but because it was the thing your hands and eyes needed to do when your mind was trying to process something large. 23, he said finally. "Yes, disease and drought. That's what the records say." Mercer looked at the cattle for another moment. Then he looked at Nathan. "The records are wrong." "Records were adjusted," Nathan said. "There's a difference." Distinction landed visibly. Mercer's jaw tightened. "Adjusted by who?" "I believe Vale." "But he's not alone." Nathan told him about the 2 sets of tracks. Kept the description factual, specific, not accusatory beyond what the evidence supported, because wild accusations made in anger served no one, and he'd seen enough of them to know they had a way of muddying water you needed to stay clear. Mercer listened without interrupting, which was how Mercer listened to everything important. When Nathan finished, Mercer looked back at the cattle and was quiet for a while. "Guy hired Grayson Vale 4 years ago," he said. "He came with good references and a solid work history, and he's never given me a reason to doubt him that I could see." He paused. "That's the thing, isn't it? That I couldn't see it. People who do this kind of thing are specifically skilled at being undetectable," Nathan said. "The fact that you didn't see it doesn't mean you weren't looking." "That's a generous interpretation," Mercer said. "It's an accurate one." Mercer turned his horse toward the canyon entrance, and Nathan followed, and they rode back south in the same kind of quiet they'd ridden north in, but with different weight inside it. About halfway back, Mercer said, without preamble, "Tell me now who you are." Nathan had thought about how to have this conversation. He'd considered different sequences, different framings, different amounts of context to provide before the central fact. Turned it over in his mind the way you work a splinter carefully, from multiple angles, trying to find the approach that does the least damage. In the end, he said it simply. I hold the operating debt on Blackthorn Ridge. Purchased it 14 months ago from the Consolidated Territorial Bank. The silence that followed was very long. Mercer rode. Horse's ears flicked. A hawk somewhere overhead made a sound and was gone. Own the debt, Mercer said. Yes, which means the default notice. Holston filed against a debt instrument that I control. He acquired what he thought was a clean claim through a series of intermediate transactions designed to obscure the chain of ownership. Nathan kept his voice even. It was wrong about the chain. Mercer pulled his horse to a stop. Nathan stopped beside him. Mercer was staring at the middle distance, not at Nathan, not at the trail ahead, but at a point somewhere between them that seemed to represent the space where everything he'd understood about the past 3 weeks was being reordered. When he finally looked at Nathan, his expression was not what Nathan had braced for. It wasn't fury. It wasn't betrayal, or not primarily. It was something closer to exhausted recognition, the look of a man who has suspected something at the edge of his awareness for weeks, and is now watching it come fully into focus. Came here to see if it was worth saving, Mercer said. Yes. And your conclusion? My conclusion, Nathan said, is that it is. That the reasons it's worth saving have nothing to do with the acreage or the cattle numbers or the operating margins. Mercer looked at him for a long time. Then he said, You should have told me who you were. Yes, Nathan said. I should have. The absence of justification in that answer did something to Mercer's expression. Some of the hardness in it shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet. Maybe not entirely, but the particular relaxing of a man who has been braced for someone to argue with him and found, instead, agreement. What happens now? Mercer asked. Now I stop the default process. Takes a few days. My attorney is already moving on it. Then we deal with Vale and whoever his contact at Halston's operation is, and we recover what was taken, and we make sure the books reflect reality rather than what someone wanted reality to look like. And Halston? Halston made a significant legal error when he filed that default notice. He filed it against a debt instrument he didn't actually control, which means the filing itself is fraudulent. It gives us something to work with. Nathan paused. It's not finished, but he's exposed himself. Mercer absorbed this. You have enough to act on. Almost. I still need to confirm the connection between Vale and Halston, something that goes beyond circumstantial. Something that will hold up. What does that look like? Looks like Vale making contact with Halston's operation in a way I can document. Nathan met his eyes. Which may be about to happen, if the wagon to Cutter's Mill didn't find what it was supposed to find yesterday. Mercer understood the implication. Vale will try again. He'll need to explain the delay to whoever is managing the Cutter's Mill end, Nathan said. And that explanation will have to happen through a channel I can follow. Rode the rest of the way back in silence. But it was a different silence than before, not the quiet of two men being careful with each other, but the quiet of two men who have, finally, arrived at the same understanding of the ground they're standing on. Confirmation of what Nathan needed came from a direction he hadn't anticipated, and it came through Evelyn. She found him at the corral fence the following afternoon, and stood beside him the way she had weeks ago. Shoulder, not quite touching shoulder, looking at the hills. Mashi, and she said, Danny told me something when he got back from Cutter's Mill yesterday. What did he say? He said the supply contact at Cutter's Mill, the man who was supposed to have an order ready for pickup, seemed surprised to see him. Said the order had been canceled. But when Danny pressed him on it, the man corrected himself and said the order had been delayed. And then he seemed flustered, like he'd said something wrong, and he stopped talking and found the order after all, and sent Danny on his way. Nathan thought about this. Danny tell Mercer? Danny didn't think it was particularly significant. Told me because I asked him about the trip. Why did you ask him about the trip? Evelyn gave him the look that meant you know exactly why. 'Cause you rode out before dawn 2 days ago and came back with that particular look on your face, she said. And then you went to find Mercer, and the two of you went off together the next morning, and neither of you has been quite normal since. Nathan almost smiled. That particular look. Don't be pleased about it, she said without heat. Means you're readable to me, which I'm not sure is a condition you intended. I didn't intend most of what's happened here, he said quietly. She let that sit for a moment. Then she said Mercer knows. About you? Yes, and he hasn't done anything dramatic. He's still deciding how he feels about it, I think. That seems right for him. She paused. When are you going to tell the rest of it to me? The full version. Nathan turned away from the fence and faced her directly. 3 weeks he'd known Evelyn Hartwell. He'd watched her navigate a hostile kitchen. Identify financial fraud. Delay a wagon through calculated misdirection. Sit across from him in a small room and hand him information she'd risked her position to gather. D. She had done all of this without complaint, without performance, and without any apparent expectation of acknowledgement beyond the satisfaction of having addressed a problem correctly. She deserved the truth. She had deserved it for longer than he'd given it to her. He told her everything. Not in the careful, sequenced way he'd told Mercer. That version had been constructed for a specific purpose, calibrated to produce a specific response. What he told Evelyn was the unedited version. He told her about reviewing the ledgers from a distance and deciding he needed to see the ranch with his own eyes. He told her about the canvas duffel bag and the deliberate disguise of ordinariness. He told her about counting the cattle on his 4th day and feeling the discrepancy in the numbers like a wrong note in a familiar song. He told her about the tack room and Vale coming out with papers in his pocket. He told her about the box canyon. He told her that he held the debt, that the default notice was fraudulent, that Halston had tried to buy a legal weapon he didn't actually own. He watched her face throughout all of this. She was still. Not cold still, not the stillness of someone shutting down, but the stillness of someone processing information with their full attention, the way a person reads a letter that matters. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long have you been doing this? Going into operations undercover?" "A few years. Not often. Only when I can't understand something from the outside." "Does it work?" "It worked here," he said. She looked at him. "Worked here because I handed you 3 weeks of evidence on a piece of paper," she said. Not harshly factually. "Yes," he said. "That's true." Something in her expression shifted. Not softening exactly, more like the dropping of a held tension, the particular release of someone who has been waiting for a specific acknowledgement and has received it. "I'm not angry," she said. "I want to be. Because there were moments I trusted you in ways I wouldn't have if I'd known." She stopped. Chose different words. "But I also understand why you did it the way you did it. I understand the reasoning. It doesn't mean it doesn't sting." "Should sting," Nathan said. "I'm sorry for that part." She looked at him steadily. "Don't apologize for the part that worked," she said. "Apologize for the part where you decided you'd wait, even when you could see I was out on a limb." Her voice was even, but the words had weight. "When I showed you that paper, I had no idea who you were. I trusted a hired hand named Nathan with information that could have cost me this job, or worse if it had gone wrong." "I know," he said. "That's a significant thing to take on faith." "I know that too." She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she took a breath and let it out slowly. "So, what happens now?" And Nathan told her the same things he told Mercer, the attorney in the default process, and Croft, the investigator coming from the Capitol, the plan to document Vale's contact with Halston's network. Evelyn listened. When he got to the part about Vale and the Cutter's Mill connection, she said, "The man Danny spoke to, the one who said canceled and then corrected himself, is he connected to Halston directly? I believe he's a go-between. Someone who facilitates the movement of the cattle and the money without being visibly connected to either party. So the chain is Vale go-between Halston." That's my current read. "You need Vale to make contact with the go-between in a way you can see," she said. "Yes." She thought for a moment. Vale is going to try again. "Probably within the next few days, now that the wagon delay has disrupted whatever was supposed to happen in Cutter's Mill." She looked at Nathan. "What if he doesn't do it through an obvious channel? What if he does it through something smaller? A letter, a messenger, something low profile?" Nathan had been thinking the same thing. "Then I need to be in a position to intercept it. Or," Evelyn said carefully, "you need someone who moves through this ranch without drawing attention to do it for you." The implication was clear. "No," Nathan said. "I've already done more dangerous things than reading someone's outgoing correspondence," she said. "Evelyn, don't use that tone," she said, without sharpness but with finality. "I'm not asking for your permission. I'm telling you what I'm capable of doing. You can decide whether to include me in the plan, or you can decide to leave me out of it, and I'll do it on my own." She paused. "I'd rather you include me." Nathan looked at her and thought about the canyon at first light and the northwest tracks and the unknown second person, and the specific risk that Evelyn Hartwell had no idea she was contemplating. Gee. Then he thought about the mining company and the man named Calder, and what she'd said about watching something collapse because the people with authority hadn't acted. He thought about a lot of things in a short amount of time. "If I include you," he said, "you follow my lead on timing. Don't move until I say." "Agreed. And if it gets complicated?" "Everything is already complicated," she said. "That's not a condition, that's just true." Nathan looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "All right." Words sat between them, with a different weight than either of them had used before, not the weight of a concession or a compromise, but the weight of two people deciding to trust each other fully, explicitly, for the first time, after weeks of doing it incompletely and at distance. Vale made his move 2 nights later. Nathan had been watching for it, not constantly, not in a way that would read as surveillance, but with the peripheral awareness of someone who has decided that a particular person is the most important variable in a room and adjusted accordingly. He'd noticed the subtle rhythm of Vale's habits, the way he always took the last watch, if he could, the way he made a show of sleeping early on the nights when he was planning to be awake, a slight adjustment in his posture when he was making a decision versus when he was simply moving through his day. And the second night after Nathan and Evelyn's conversation, Vale slept ostentatiously early. Nathan was still. He kept his breathing regular. He heard Vale's bunk creak and then go quiet, and he waited, and at midnight he heard the soft scrape of boots on the bunkhouse floor. Let Vale leave. He counted to 60, then he followed. Vale went to the barn, not to the tack room this time, but to the far corner where the feed was stored, and he retrieved something from behind the grain sacks. A small parcel, wrapped in oilcloth. He stood with it for a moment. Nathan, watching from the shadow of the barn door, was close enough to see the particular set of Vale's shoulders, not anxious, not rushed, but concentrated, the way a man is when he's doing something he's done before and needs to do correctly. Vale tucked the parcel into his coat and left the barn by the side door. Nathan followed at enough distance to stay invisible, and close enough that losing him in the dark was not an option. Night was moonlit, which was both helpful and dangerous helpful, because Nathan could see, dangerous because he could be seen. Vale walked northeast, not toward the canyon, a different direction, toward the ranch's back fence line, where the land ran up against the foothills and the terrain got rocky enough that tracks became harder to read. There was a gate in the back fence, a small one used for moving equipment in and out of the high pasture, and Nathan had checked it 3 days ago and found the chain unlocked. It was unlocked now, too. Vale went through the gate. Nathan stopped before it. There was a man waiting on the other side. Gaw. Nathan pressed himself against the fence and looked through the gap between the gatepost and the fence line. The other man was on horseback, a dark horse, standing quietly, the kind of animal that had been trained not to make noise in the dark. The rider was not someone Nathan recognized by silhouette or by the brief glimpse of face when he turned toward Vale, but the horse Nathan recognized. It was a distinctive animal, one white sock on the right foreleg, a slightly heavier build than the surrounding country horses, the kind of horse that a working man wouldn't ride because it was too noticeable. It was the kind of horse that belonged in a stable in town, attached to a man of means who didn't think anyone out here was paying close enough attention to remember it. Nathan had seen that horse in the yard at Blackthorn Ridge exactly once. When Victor Halston had come to visit, this was not a go-between. This was Halston himself. The meeting was brief, less than 5 minutes. Vale handed over the oilcloth parcel. Halston said something that Nathan couldn't hear. Vale said something back. Halston said something else, and his voice rose just enough that Nathan caught the final word, which was soon. Then Halston turned the horse and rode back into the darkness of the foothills, moving at a pace that suggested familiarity with the terrain. Vale came back through the gate. He was perhaps 15 feet from Nathan when he stopped. Nathan did not move, did not breathe. Vale stood very still. Silence stretched. Then Vale's shoulders dropped. Almost imperceptibly, he walked past the gatepost and back toward the barn, close enough that Nathan could have touched him. He didn't. He waited until Vale was back inside. Then he stood in the moonlight with his heart beating at a rate that he noticed consciously, which meant it was elevated, which was information about how close that had been. He turned and walked back to the barn by a different route, and he retrieved the thing he'd left there earlier that evening, a small notebook. And in the notebook, written in a hand that a court of law would accept as contemporaneous documentation, date, the time, location, and a description of what he'd just witnessed, including the white-socked horse and the word soon. Put the notebook back in his coat. He went back to his bunk. He lay there until his heart settled. Then he stared at the ceiling and thought about what he'd seen, gut, and what it meant, and what happened next. What it meant was that Halston had not filed the default notice and then sat back to wait. He was actively managing the scheme from close range. He was meeting with Vale, personally. What night? On the back edge of the ranch. which meant he had a direct stake in the timeline and was not willing to manage it through intermediaries. That level of personal involvement was both useful and dangerous. Useful because it created exposure. Dangerous because it meant Halston was paying close attention to the state of his plan, and if anything disrupted it visibly, he would react. Word soon was the piece Nathan couldn't quite see yet. Soon meant something specific, a date, an action, a point at which the next step was supposed to execute. Default notice had a 30-day clock. They were 14 days into it, which meant soon was in the next 2 weeks, which meant Nathan was out of time for careful. He was going to have to move. In the morning, he found Evelyn before breakfast and told her what he'd seen, quietly and completely. She listened with her arms crossed and her eyes steady, and when he finished, she said, "Parcel. What was in it?" "I don't know. I couldn't see clearly enough." "Documents," she said. "Has to be. Physical documents, something Vale had that Halston needed to have in hand. Possibly the original falsified records, the ones Vale took from the tack room." Expression shifted. "He's cleaning up after himself."
Yes.
"Which means he knows something is coming." "He's following a pre-arranged schedule," Nathan said. "Either way, the effect is the same." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You need to move before he finishes cleaning up. Before whatever soon means happens." "Yes. What do you need from me?" Nathan looked at her. In the thin morning light coming through the kitchen window, she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the particular exhaustion of carrying knowledge that has weight. He'd put some of that weight on her, and he was aware of it, and he didn't insult her by apologizing for it again. "Secondary records," he said. "The ones in the tack room, Vale took the originals, but there may be copies. Duplicates that were made before he got to them. I didn't go through everything in there because I didn't want to leave traces." "You want me to go through it. You have a legitimate reason to access the tack room. Inventory of equipment and supplies falls within your stated role. And I'm looking for anything with numbers on it that references cattle counts or supply figures from the last 14 months, he said. Specifically anything that shows 2 different versions of the same data. Original and a revision. She nodded. "When? Today, if you can manage it naturally." "I can manage it naturally," she said, with a dryness that contained no self-congratulation, just certainty. She turned back to the stove. Nathan left the kitchen and went to find a way to get his letter to the morning mail stage, because the attorney in the capital needed to know that the timeline had compressed and that soon was not a comfort anymore. It was a deadline. The letter reached his attorney in 3 days. Nathan knew this because on the morning of the 4th day, Mercer came to find him with the expression of a man who has received unexpected news and is still deciding how to arrange his face around it. He found Nathan at the water pump behind the barn, where Nathan was working a stuck valve that had been sticking for 2 weeks and that nobody had gotten around to fixing, because stuck valves rank low on the priority list of a ranch in crisis. "Wire came in from the capital this morning," Mercer said. Nathan kept working the valve. "What did it say?" "That a legal challenge has been filed against the default notice. The filing cites fraudulent chain of ownership." Mercer paused. "Signed by an attorney named Aldrich, who I'm guessing works for you." "He does," Nathan said. The valve gave. Water came through clean and strong, and Nathan stepped back and wiped his hands on his trousers and looked at Mercer. Mercer was watching him with that particular expression he'd been wearing since the canyon, the one that had moved past the early shock of revelation into something more complicated and less easily named. Not resentment exactly, not trust exactly. Something in the territory between them still finding its shape. "What does the challenge mean?" "Practically," Mercer said. "Means the 30-day clock is paused while the filing is reviewed. It also means Halston's lawyers have to respond, which puts them on the record. Anything they put on the record becomes discoverable." Nathan leaned against the barn wall. "It also means Halston knows the clock has changed. Concerns you. It means he'll move faster." He was already planning something in the next 2 weeks. I heard the word soon at that meeting. "A legal challenge from my attorney tells him that someone is countering, even if he doesn't know yet who's behind it." Nathan looked at the water flowing cleanly from the pump. Push up whatever he was planning. Mercer was quiet for a moment. "How much time do we have?" "Days," Nathan said. "Maybe less." Mercer absorbed this. Then he said, "Croft, the investigator you mentioned. When does he arrive?" "He should have left the capital 2 days ago. If he's riding hard, he could be here by tomorrow evening." In the meantime, Nathan said, "we keep the ranch running exactly as normal. Nobody changes their behavior. Nobody gives Vale a reason to think anything has shifted. He met Mercer's eyes. Especially not you. Mercer's jaw tightened. You're asking me to work beside a man who's been stealing from this ranch for a year and act like I don't know it. That's not easy. No, Nathan said, it isn't. Vale runs before we have the full documentation. We lose the connection to Halston. We might save the ranch, but Halston walks away clean. And a man like Halston doesn't accept a setback quietly. He regroups and tries again. Mercer stood with this for a moment. Nathan could see the cost of it on his face, the specific cost of choosing strategy over the immediate satisfaction of confrontation, which is one of the most uncomfortable choices a person with a temper and a sense of justice can be asked to make. All right, Mercer said finally. But I want to be there when it happens. You will be, Nathan said. I promise you that. Evelyn found the copies. She came to Nathan that afternoon with a calm face and a folded piece of paper in her apron pocket, and she waited until they were alone near the root cellar before she handed it to him. The paper was a copy she'd made herself, quick, accurate, the handwriting of someone who writes to be read later, rather than in the moment of two separate documents she'd found behind a loose board in the back of the tack room's lower shelf. Documents were cattle count sheets. Two versions of the same sheet, same date, different numbers. Original showed a count of 312 head. Revised version, the one that had made it into the official ledger, showed 289. Difference of 23 head, which matched exactly the count Nathan had found in the canyon. But the more important discovery was the signature on the original sheet. Vale signed the original, Evelyn said quietly, his own handwriting before the revision. Which means there's a version of these records with his name on the accurate numbers, and a version with his name on the falsified ones. Both exist. Nathan looked at the copy she'd made. He didn't destroy the original. I think he meant to. I think this was part of what he was cleaning up, but he was moving from a list, not from memory, and something in his system put this one on a later date than it should have been. She paused. Or he hid it so well he forgot where he put it, either way. Either way, she agreed. Nathan folded the copy and put it with his notebook. Did you put everything back exactly as you found it? Board is back. The shelf is exactly as it was. She looked at him steadily. Won't know I was there. Nathan nodded. Then he said, You're good at this. I told you, she said. I've seen this shape before. That's not what I mean. He looked at her. I mean, you're good at staying composed when the thing you're doing is genuinely dangerous, and that's not the same as competence with numbers or systems. It's a different kind of capability. She was quiet for a moment. My mother used to say that composure is just fear with better posture, she said. She meant it as a criticism. I decided it was a compliment. Nathan almost smiled. Not the performance of a smile, but the real thing. Small and involuntary. Kind that happens before you've decided to let it. Gee. He turned back toward the ranch yard, and she fell into step beside him, and they walked back across the yard in the ordinary way of two people who worked the same place and had no specific reason to be noticed. Croft arrived the following evening. Came in a plain wagon with a cover that suggested a traveling merchant and a manner that confirmed absolutely nothing about what he actually did for a living, which was the specific quality Nathan valued in him above all others. 50. Unremarkable in every physical feature, with the kind of face that people forget immediately after meeting it. This was not an accident. Croft had spent 30 years cultivating that forgettability the way other men cultivated reputations. Nathan met him at the gate after dark, and they spent an hour in the barn with a lamp turned low while Nathan laid out everything he had. Notebook with the dated entries, Evelyn's copies of the dual cattle count sheets, the list of fraudulent vendors, the documentation of the midnight meeting with the white-socked horse. Croft listened without asking questions until Nathan was done. Then he asked 3 questions, each of which revealed that he'd been paying very close attention to everything Nathan had said and had identified the 3 weak points in the evidentiary chain with the precision of a man who understood exactly what a territorial court would require versus what Nathan found personally convincing. 3 weak points were chain of custody for the duplicate cattle sheets, positive identification of Halston at the midnight meeting, and the connection between the fraudulent vendor payments and Halston's operation specifically, as opposed to simply Vale's personal theft. Sheets are solid if the woman who found them testifies to where and how she found them, Croft said. The identification of Halston is your word against his, which is a problem unless we have corroboration or can find the physical evidence of those meetings. The horse, Nathan said. A distinctive horse is suggestive. It's not proof. Horses change hands. Croft paused. But if Halston visits again, which, given the pressure of the legal challenge, he very well might, and we can document that visit with a second witness. It's different. Vendor connection? The P.O. box in Cutter's Mill, Croft said. We can establish who controls that box and connect them to Halston's financial network. The vendor payments become part of a coordinated scheme rather than Vale acting alone. He looked at Nathan. It changes everything, because a coordinated scheme with an outside party is conspiracy, not just embezzlement. Do you need to make that connection? Access to the postal records in Cutter's Mill. Ideally, something from the parcel Vale passed to Halston at that meeting. Croft's expression didn't change. We obviously don't have the parcel. No, then Cutter's Mill is the priority. I'll go tomorrow. Nathan looked at him. Halston's people will be watching that post office. I've been looked at by people who were paid to see things and failed to see me, Croft said, without vanity, simply as a statement of professional record. I'll be careful. The day Croft left for Cutter's Mill was the day Grayson Vale noticed something was wrong. Nathan couldn't identify the specific moment, but he felt the shift in the way you feel a change in a room's temperature, not dramatic, not sudden, but a gradual awareness that the air was different. Vale had always been composed in the way of someone who had decided what to present and was disciplined about maintaining that presentation. But on this particular day, there was a quality to his stillness that was subtly different from his usual stillness, less settled, more managed. He was watching things. Not obviously. Not in the way that would read as surveillance to anyone who wasn't already paying attention. But Nathan had spent 30 days watching Vale watch the ranch, and he knew the difference between Vale's ordinary ambient awareness and Vale's operational awareness, and what he was seeing now was the latter. Something had changed for Vale. He'd received information or noticed something that had shifted his calculation. Nathan spent the morning working the North Corral and keeping Vale in his peripheral vision and trying to identify what had triggered it. He went through the list of changes in the past 48 hours. The wire from Aldrich, which Mercer had received, and which Vale might have known about through the ranch's general awareness that a wire had come in. Croft's arrival, which had been managed carefully, but not invisibly. Someone might have seen the wagon at the gate. Revlin's visit to the tack room, which she'd managed with precision, but which had, necessarily, taken place in the physical space where Vale's hidden materials were stored. Any one of these might have been enough. All three together was probably more than enough for a man of Vale's awareness. Nathan calculated the odds that Vale would run versus the odds that Vale would try to complete whatever he'd been working toward and then run. Man who runs before completing his work leaves something unfinished that can be used against him. The man who completes his work and then runs has a cleaner exit. Vale was disciplined and methodical. He would try to finish, which meant Nathan had a short window in which Vale was still present and still accessible before whatever completion meant was reached. He went to find Mercer. They talked in the office with the door latched. Mercer sat behind the desk and Nathan sat across from it. And for the first time since Nathan had walked into Blackthorn Ridge, physical arrangement of the room felt honest, the owner on one side of the desk, the man he'd hired on the other. Relationship between them finally matching its actual nature. Vale's spooked, Nathan said. I don't know how much time we have before he decides the risk of staying outweighs the benefit of finishing. What's he trying to finish? I think the parcel he passed to Halston contained the original falsified records. Halston has those now, which means if Vale runs, the physical evidence of what he did goes with Halston. That's Vale's protection. Halston holds the documents that incriminate Vale, which means Vale is only safe as long as Halston is willing to protect him. Nathan paused. But Vale still has something Halston needs, or he wouldn't still be here. If he'd handed over everything useful, he'd have already gone. Mercer thought about this. What does Halston still need from him? Access, Nathan said. Specifically access to the ranch's legal documentation. The land deed, the water rights certificates, the grazing agreements. These are physical documents originals, and they're what Halston would need to complete a forced transfer of ownership. If the default process succeeded, he'd need to move quickly to record the transfer before anyone could challenge it. Nathan looked at Mercer. Where are those documents kept? Mercer's expression changed. Safe in this office. Who knows the combination? Myself and Mercer stopped, his jaw tightened. And Vale. I gave it to him 2 years ago when I had that bout of pneumonia and couldn't get out of bed for 2 weeks, in case anything needed accessing. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man realizing, in concrete and irreversible terms, that a trust he'd extended in good faith had been the specific mechanism of his own endangerment. Nathan let the silence be what it was. He didn't fill it with reassurance or redirection. Some moments needed to be fully experienced, to be fully understood. "It hasn't touched the safe," Mercer said finally. Came out as a statement, but it had the shape of a question. "Not yet? If he had, he'd be gone." Nathan leaned forward. "He's waiting for the right moment. Something that creates enough chaos or distraction that the access looks either innocent or goes unnoticed. Given the legal challenge to the default notice, Halston is going to push for that moment sooner rather than later." Mercer stood up from behind the desk. The movement had the quality of someone who has been sitting inside a bad feeling for long enough and has decided that standing is at least a different position to hold it in. "What do we do?" "We change the combination tonight, without telling Vale or appearing to be doing anything unusual." Nathan thought for a moment. "We put something in the safe that looks like the original documents, but isn't. Close enough to pass a quick check." Mercer looked at him. "Done this before. The specific version of this?" "No." "General principle of controlling what someone thinks they have access to?" "Yes." "Where do I get false documents on short notice?" "You don't," Nathan said. "Evelyn does. It was by any reasonable measure an absurd request to make of a woman who had been hired to cook." Nathan understood this. He went to Evelyn, with that understanding fully formed in his mind, and he presented the request without preamble or apology, because she had made clear several weeks ago that she preferred directness to the performance of consideration. He needed her to replicate the general appearance of a land deed and 2 accompanying certificates, well enough to pass a brief visual check in poor light by someone who would be moving quickly and under pressure. Explained why. Evelyn listened to the full explanation. Then she said, "What kind of paper are the originals on?" "Heavier than standard. Official stock. I have parchment in the kitchen. I use it for lining the baking pans." She thought for a moment. "It's not the same, but in poor light at a quick glance it's close enough. Text do I need to replicate?" "The general format of a land deed, the headings, the legal language, the structure. It doesn't need to be accurate. It needs to look accurate from 2 feet away with a lamp turned low." "How much time do I have?" "I'd like it done before morning." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he'd come to recognize as her version of this is an unreasonable request, and I'm going to do it anyway. Then she went to the kitchen, and he didn't see her again until past midnight, when she appeared at the office door with 3 sheets of parchment that had been carefully aged along the edges with tea, and written in a hand that mimicked official script well enough that Nathan had to look twice before he was certain they weren't real. "That's remarkable," he said. "I had a teacher who believed in penmanship," she said. "At the time I thought it was excessive." Nathan placed the false documents in the safe, on top of the actual ones, which he'd moved to a locked box behind the wall panel, a secondary compartment that Mercer had shown him and that Vale almost certainly didn't know about. Then he reset the combination with Mercer watching, to a sequence that neither of them said aloud, but that Mercer wrote on a small card he put in his boot. They locked the office and went to their separate sleeps, and Nathan lay in the bunkhouse with the particular alertness of someone who has set a trap and is waiting to see what walks into it. Vale moved on the 3rd night. Not the next night was quiet in a way that felt like held breath, ranch going about its evening routine, while Nathan tracked the quality of Vale's stillness and judged it to be still in the waiting mode rather than the acting mode. But on the 3rd night, around 2 in the morning, the bunkhouse door opened very quietly, and the particular sound of Vale's boots lighter on the left than the right. Barely perceptible unevenness that Nathan had catalogued weeks ago moved across the floor and out. Nathan was out the window 30 seconds later. He'd left his boots on inside his blankets and had been sleeping in his socks for 2 nights, and he had them laced up before Vale had cleared the yard. He followed Vale to the main house, hung back while Vale dealt with the front door in a way that suggested a key, and then moved to the office window. Asked he'd Mercer, 3 days ago, to leave the latch on the office window loose enough to lift from outside if pressed with a knife blade. Mercer had done this without comment, in the way Mercer did most things now, with the quiet efficiency of a man who had decided to trust someone and was carrying that decision through regardless of how it felt. Nathan was inside the office in under a minute. Vale was at the safe. The lamp Vale had brought was turned very low, and in its minimal light, he was working the combination with the focus of a man who has done this before and knows the sequence. The tumblers turned, the safe opened. Vale reached inside, pulled out the false documents, spent perhaps 45 seconds looking at them, And in that time, Nathan stayed motionless against the office wall, 3 feet behind him, breathing through his nose in measured intervals, watching Vale's back. Vale folded the documents and put them inside his coat, closed the safe. He stood and turned and stopped, because Nathan was standing there. The two men looked at each other in the near dark. Vale's face went through several expressions, very quickly surprise, then the covering of surprise, then the rapid calculation of a man assessing a situation that has gone wrong and weighing options. "Nathan," Vale said. His voice was steady. Whatever he was feeling, his voice had been trained out of showing it. "Grayson," Nathan said, a beat of silence. "I can explain what this looks like," Vale said. "You don't need to," Nathan said. "I know what it is." Another beat. Vale's eyes moved not toward the door, which was too obvious, but toward the desk, where the lamp sat. Thought Nathan understood that move and shifted his weight slightly to indicate that he was between Vale and the desk. "The documents you're carrying are not the originals," Nathan said. "Originals were moved 3 days ago. What you have is parchment paper with ink on it." Vale was very still. "The safe combination was also changed 3 days ago," Nathan continued. "The fact that you opened it tonight tells me you had the previous combination, which tells me everything I need to tell a territorial court about your level of access and your intentions." Vale looked at him steadily. The calculation behind his eyes was almost visible, a rapid, experienced assessment of how much Nathan knew, how much Nathan could prove, and what the available responses were. "Not a ranch hand," Vale said. "No, how long?" "Since before I arrived." Vale exhaled. It was not a long exhale, not dramatic, just the specific exhalation of a man releasing the weight of a position he'd been holding and has now lost. "Holston doesn't know about you," he said. "I know. He's going to." "Also, yes," Nathan said. "That's happening regardless of what you decide in the next few minutes." Vale looked at him. The calculation was still running, but the range of options had narrowed considerably, and they both knew it. "What are you offering?" he said. "I'm not offering anything yet," Nathan said. "I'm telling you that cooperation changes what I take to the court versus what I hold back. Holston's operation is the target. Your choices over the next 24 hours determine how central you are to what happens to it." "That's not an offer," Vale said. "That's a threat in different clothes." "It's an accurate description of your situation," Nathan said. "What you choose to do with it is up to you." The silence in the room was very specific. Not the silence of deadlock, but the silence of one man deciding and another man waiting without apparent anxiety for that decision to be made. Vale reached into his coat and took out the false documents. "Set them on the desk." "What do you need from me?" he said. Nathan looked at the documents on the desk and then at Vale. "Sit down," he said. "This is going to take a while." They talked for 2 hours. What Vale gave Nathan over those 2 hours was its totality. Complete architecture of Holston's scheme, not the edges and outlines that Nathan had assembled through observation and inference, but the interior of it, the mechanisms and the timelines and the names. It was more than Nathan had expected, and the reasons it was more than he'd expected was a reason that made Nathan revise his understanding of Vale in a direction that was neither simpler nor more comfortable than the one he'd started with. Vale had not done this for money, or not primarily. Holston had approached him 3 years ago with a different kind of leverage. It was a debt not financial, but the kind that's harder to discharge. Situation. A history. A person Vale had wronged in a context predating Blackthorn Ridge. Holston had found it and held it the way powerful men hold things they find, which is carefully and indefinitely. "He told me what he needed," Vale said. His voice was flat in the way of someone who has stopped managing their voice because the management takes more than they have left. "He told me what would happen if I didn't provide it. I made a choice." He paused. "I'm not asking you to think well of it." Nathan looked at him. He had spent 30 days thinking of Grayson Vale as a threat, a mechanism, a moving part in a scheme that needed to be stopped. That had been accurate. It was also incomplete, the way most accurate things about people are incomplete. "Person Holston used against you," Nathan said. "Safe?" Vale blinked. The question had not been what he expected. "Yes," he said after a moment. "He only needed the threat. He never needed to act on it. Then acting on it now loses him his leverage over you." Vale was quiet. "Which means the thing that kept you in this is gone the moment you go on the record," Nathan said. "Can't use a threat that's already been disclosed and documented." Vale looked at him for a long moment. Something in his expression was difficult to name, not gratitude, not relief, but something adjacent to both. Complicated feeling of a person who has been carrying a thing alone for a long time and has just unexpectedly been offered the possibility of setting it down. Understand, Vale said slowly, that going on record means I'm going on record too. Yes. For what I did here, yes. And you're telling me to do it anyway. Nathan met his eyes. I'm telling you that the alternative is that Halston continues. Not just here. Somewhere else with someone else, using the same methods. He's done it before. Blackthorn Ridge is not the first operation he's disassembled this way. He paused. You're not the first person he's put in this position either. Vale absorbed this. Then he said quietly, how do you know that? Because men who are this practiced at leverage don't learn it on their first attempt, Nathan said. The room was quiet for a moment. I'll go on record, Vale said. Dawn, Nathan wrote a second letter to Aldrich. He wrote a third letter to a contact in the territorial marshal's office, whose name he'd kept in reserve for exactly this kind of development. Meh. He gave both letters to Mercer with specific instructions about the morning mail stage, and Mercer took them without asking what was in them, which was the right call. Then Nathan went to the kitchen. Evelyn was there, as she always was at that hour, but she wasn't cooking. She was sitting at the kitchen table, with her hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She looked up when Nathan came in with an expression that told him she'd been awake for most of the night and had heard, or intuited, or both, that things had moved. Nathan sat down across from her and told her about Vale. He told her about the 2 hours of conversation, the leverage Halston had held, choice Vale had made 3 years ago, and the choice he'd made last night. He told her about the letters going out that morning. When he finished, Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, looking at the cold coffee in her cup. Then she said, he did something terrible under terrible pressure. Yes. Does that change what happens to him? Some of it, Nathan said. Not all of it. He'll be accountable. But how accountable and to what degree is going to depend on what his testimony does to Halston's case. She nodded. The nod was slow, the kind that means acceptance of a complex reality rather than agreement with a simple one. Then Halston. Halston is about to find out that the default notice is legally void, that his inside contact has turned, and that a territorial marshal is being asked to review 14 months of fraudulent financial activity. Nathan paused. That's going to be a very bad few days for Victor Halston. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she looked up at him. Going to have to tell the crew. I know. All of them. Everything. I know that too. How do you think they'll take it? Nathan thought about Danny, who was 19 and asked where people were from, and thought the most important questions were the ones that began with why. He thought about Prescott, who was practical and unflappable and would want to know what it meant for his wages. He thought about Mercer, who already knew and was still here and was still extending the choice he'd made. I think some of them will be angry, Nathan said. I think they have the right to be. And after the angry? I don't know, he said honestly. That part's up to them. Evelyn looked at him steadily. There was something in her expression that had changed since the early weeks, not softened. That wasn't the right word, because Evelyn hadn't been hard to begin with. Settled, maybe. The particular settling of a person who has made a series of difficult decisions and found that they can live with the decisions they made and are beginning to understand that this is actually quite a lot to be able to say. For what it's worth, she said, I think they'll be all right. These men, they're not here, because it's easy. They've been staying through a crisis that most sensible people would have walked away from. She looked at her cold coffee. That kind of staying says something about a person. It does, Nathan said. It says they care about the place, more than the place has been caring about them lately. Yes. She looked up at him. Don't let that be wasted. It wasn't a request. It was the most direct thing she'd said to him in 30 days. And it was the clearest articulation of what Nathan had been trying to understand. From a distance and then from inside, since the moment he'd first looked at the ledgers and thought, something here is worth saving. Gaw. He sat across from her in the cold kitchen in the early morning light, and he thought about what it cost to walk into a place with nothing and decide it was worth your effort. He thought about what it cost to walk into the same place with everything and decide the same thing. They were different costs. They were, he thought, equivalent ones. It won't be, he said. He meant it the way people mean things when they've stopped performing meaning and started inhabiting it. And she looked at him and seemed to understand the difference. Because she didn't answer, she just reached across the table and moved his cold coffee cup slightly closer to him. Gesture so small and so ordinary that it shouldn't have mattered, and mattered entirely. Croft returned from Cutter's Mill late that same afternoon with the postal records, obtained through methods that Nathan judged it better not to ask about in detail, and the name of the P. Go box holder was not E. Graves. It was a company called Halston Territorial Holdings, registered in the capital under a subsidiary structure designed to create distance between the payments and their origin, but not quite enough distance to survive a trained investigator's scrutiny. Chain was complete. Fraudulent vendor payments from Blackthorn Ridge through the Cutter's Mill P. Go box to a subsidiary controlled by Victor Halston. Cattle removed from the ranch's inventory and held in a canyon on unmarked land, ready to be sold once the foreclosure removed the brand owner. Default notice filed against a debt instrument that the filer didn't legally control. An inside contact whose coerced cooperation had just become documentation of Halston's operating methods. Nathan sat in the office with Croft and Mercer and spread everything on the desk. Notebook, the copies of the dual cattle sheets, the false vendor invoices with the Cutter's Mill address, Croft's postal records, Vale's signed statement, which they'd had a territorial notary ride out from town that morning to certify, in a development that the notary had found puzzling but had not questioned because Mercer had offered him a reasonable fee and a good lunch. 3 men looked at what was on the desk, and nobody spoke for a moment, because sometimes the right response to the completion of a long and difficult thing is a moment of quiet that acknowledges the length and the difficulty before moving to what comes next. Then Mercer said, "Is it enough?" "It's enough," Croft said. He said it the way he said everything without flourish, as a factual assessment. "This is enough." Mercer looked at the spread of documents and then at Nathan. His expression had a quality to it that Nathan had not seen before, not the guarded wariness of the first weeks, not the complicated tension of the middle period, but something quieter and more settled. Expression of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just, for the first time in months, been permitted to put it down. "Good," Mercer said. Outside the window, the ranch was going about its afternoon. Crew was working. The horses were in the corral. Smoke was coming from the kitchen chimney because Evelyn was in there, doing what she did, making the place run in the particular way she made it run, not dramatically, not with announcement, but with the steady, intelligent, undramatic competence of someone who had decided this place was worth her effort and had not, since making that decision, looked back. Nathan looked at the documents on the desk and thought, this is what it looks like when you stop something before it finishes. Not triumphant, not clean, full of the complicated residue of what it had cost to get here, what Vale had done and why, what Mercer had carried alone for too long, what Evelyn had risked without anyone asking her to, what Nathan himself had held back, and for how long, and at what cost to people who had trusted him with things they hadn't needed to trust him with. Full of all of that, and still enough. It was enough. Tomorrow Halston would find out. Halston came to the ranch the next morning. Not at night, not cautiously, not with the careful indirection of someone managing a scheme from the shadows. Came in the black buggy, same as before, in the full light of a Thursday morning, and he pulled into the yard with the unhurried confidence of a man who believes the situation is still his to control. He had 2 men with him this time, not ranch hands, not workers, but the kind of men who ride beside wealthy men for reasons that have nothing to do with ranching. Nathan was standing on the porch of the main house when the buggy arrived. He was not wearing his worn hat or his faded shirt. He was wearing the coat he'd had in the bottom of the canvas duffel. Since the beginning, good wool, dark, the kind of coat that costs enough to say something without announcing itself. He'd shaved properly that morning, for the first time in 5 weeks, which had produced a reaction from Danny at breakfast that was equal parts confusion and amusement, and which had produced from Evelyn when she saw him come through the kitchen. A single look that lasted about 2 seconds and said several things without any of them being spoken aloud. Mercer stood to Nathan's left. Croft stood to his right, which was where Croft preferred to stand in most situations. Halston brought the buggy to a stop in the yard and climbed down with the ease of a man who has not yet been informed that the ground has shifted beneath him. He looked at Nathan on the porch, and his expression did something brief and complicated, a flicker of recalibration. The instant when a man sees something that doesn't fit the map he's been using and adjusts before anyone can see him adjust. He almost managed it. "Mr. Mercer," he said, keeping his eyes on Mercer after that first flicker. "I understand there's been some legal activity concerning the default notice. My attorneys advised me to come and discuss it directly." "That's considerate of you," Mercer said. His voice was even. He'd been working on that voice since dawn, Nathan suspected. Halston's gaze moved back to Nathan. "I don't believe we've met." "We haven't," Nathan said. "My name is Nathan Cole." "Beat." The name landed differently than Halston wanted it to land. Nathan could see the effort it took to keep his expression from showing how differently. Cole, Halston said. Are you the holder of the operating debt on Blackthorn Ridge? Nathan said. Yes. Since 14 months ago, when I purchased it from Consolidated Territorial. I believe your attorneys attempted to acquire the same instrument approximately 4 months after my purchase. He paused. They were working from outdated transfer records. Clerical situation that, I'm told, happens more often than it should. Halston looked at him. The assessment going on behind his eyes was rapid and experienced, and Nathan judged, arriving at conclusions that were accurate and unwelcome. I wasn't aware the debt had changed hands, Halston said. No, Nathan said. You weren't. The 2 men who'd ridden in with Halston were still sitting their horses at the edge of the yard, and one of them had shifted his coat back in a way that was either unconscious or deliberate, and Nathan made note of it without moving his eyes from Halston. Well, Halston said. He produced the word with a smoothness that suggested he'd needed it in difficult moments before and had gotten comfortable reaching for it. I suppose this changes the nature of our conversation. Changes several things, Nathan agreed. Shall we go inside? Sat in the office, Nathan behind the desk. Mercer, to the side, Croft near the window, with the particular stillness of someone who is being deliberately unremarkable. Gunned Halston in the chair across from the desk that Nathan had occupied weeks ago when Mercer sat where Nathan now sat. 2 men who'd come with Halston remained outside at Mercer's polite but unambiguous suggestion. Nathan put the documents on the desk between them. Didn't narrate them. He didn't explain them in sequence or build a presentation. He simply laid them out and let Halston look, because there is a particular kind of power in silence when you're the one who controls what the silence contains. Halston looked at the documents. He took his time. His face remained professionally composed, which was impressive given what he was reading, and Nathan gave him credit for it the way you give credit to a skilled opponent for a good move even when the game is lost. Not when Halston looked up. His expression had settled into something Nathan recognized. Expression of a man who has decided that his best remaining option is negotiation, which is what intelligent men decide when the alternative is worse. What do you want? Halston said. Complete withdrawal of the default notice, Nathan said. Signed documentation relinquishing any claim against Blackthorn Ridge or its assets, present or future. Full accounting of all funds that pass through the Meridian supply accounts and the 2 other vendor entities over the past 14 months. An assigned statement attesting to the coercive arrangement with your inside contact and the nature of that arrangement. Halston looked at him steadily. That last item is a confession. Yes. You understand I'll have attorneys review all of this. I'd expect nothing less, Nathan said. Your attorneys should know that a copy of everything on this desk is already with the Territorial Marshal's office, filed this morning. Second copy is with my attorney in the Capitol. This conversation is not a negotiation about whether legal proceedings occur. It's a conversation about how cooperative you choose to be within those proceedings. Halston was quiet for a moment. He looked at the documents again. Then he looked at Croft, who was standing by the window being forgettable. Something in Halston's expression shifted a slight tightening, recognition of a professional when he sees one. Your man went to Cutter's Mill, Halston said. He did, Nathan said. Another silence. Outside, the sound of the ranch operating hooves on packed dirt, distant call of one hand to another. Ordinary sounds of a place continuing to function, regardless of what was happening in a small office inside its main house. Halston put his hands on the edge of the desk. The gesture was not aggressive. It was almost tired. I'll have my attorneys contact yours, he said within the week. 3 days, Nathan said. Halston looked at him. 3 days, Nathan said again, with the particular quality of finality that is not a threat but an immovable fact. After that, the marshal's office proceeds without any record of cooperation. Halston stood. He straightened his coat with the automatic gesture of a man reassembling his presentation. He looked at Nathan for a long moment, with an expression that had multiple layers to it. The outermost layer was professional, controlled, the face of a man accepting a setback. Beneath that was something colder. And beneath that, Nathan thought he saw something that might have been, in different circumstances, respect. The acknowledgement of one opponent for another, stripped of everything except the recognition that the better position had won. He left without saying anything further. The room held its collective breath until the sound of the buggy leaving the yard reached them through the window. Then Mercer exhaled a long, slow exhale, the kind that has been stored for a while. He'll comply. Croft said from the window, watching the buggy go. Men like that always do when the alternative is exposure of the full picture. Calculate the cost, and they pay the lower one. You think he'll make trouble later? Mercer asked. I think he'll be busy for a considerable period, managing the consequences of what we've given the marshal, Nathan said. And I think men who are busy defending themselves don't have much surplus energy for new schemes. Mercer looked at the documents on the desk, and Vale. Question had weight. Nathan had been carrying it since Vale's signed statement had gone into the packet that morning. Vale cooperated fully, he said. His statement is the piece that makes the case against Halston coherent rather than circumstantial. That matters legally and practically. He paused. What happens to him is partly in the marshal's hands and partly in yours. Mercer looked at him. Mine? You're the injured party. Weight you give his cooperation in your own account of events affects how the formal process treats him. Nathan held his gaze. I'm not telling you what to decide, but I'm telling you that decision is actually yours to make. Mercer was quiet for a long time. He looked out the window at the ranch yard, at the ordinary Thursday morning continuing outside the glass. Worked beside me for 4 years, Mercer said. I know what he did. I know why too now, he paused. I don't know what to do with both of those things at once. You don't have to know today, Nathan said. Mercer looked at him. When do I have to know? When they ask you, Nathan said. Not before, he told the crew that afternoon. He'd thought about how to do it, whether to do it in pieces, one conversation at a time, or all at once. He'd decided that all at once was the honest approach, and that the honest approach was the only one he could defend to himself. Mercer gathered the men in the main room of the house after the midday meal. All of them except Vale, who had been asked to stay in the bunkhouse with Croft for company, which was a situation Vale had accepted with the quiet acceptance of a man who has run out of alternatives and is working out how to live inside that fact. Nathan stood at the head of the table and looked at the faces of the men he'd worked beside for 35 days. Danny, who was 19, and looked at the world with the directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to look sideways at it. Prescott, weathered and practical, who Nathan had come to understand thought more carefully than he spoke, which meant his silences were usually more significant than other men's words. 3 other hands, Ruiz, McKinnon, Garrett, who had absorbed the crisis of recent months with the particular stoicism of men who had decided long ago that complaining about the situation was less useful than continuing to work within it. Nathan told them who he was. Not the version he'd given Mercer, calibrated for strategic effect, the plain version. About the ledgers reviewed from a distance and the decision to come and see for himself. He told them about the canvas duffel and the worn hat and the deliberate performance of ordinariness. He told them what he'd found and what had been done to the ranch and what was now being done to address it. He told them about Vale. He kept that part factual and complete and did not editorialize about what Vale had done or why, because they were capable of forming their own assessments, and doing it for them would have been condescending. He told them the default notice was void and that Halston would be withdrawing it within 3 days. Yeah, and then he stopped talking because there was nothing else to say that wasn't already in what he'd said, and the men in the room needed the space to respond without him filling it. First person to speak was Danny. So you own the debt, Danny said, which means you could take the ranch. Technically, Nathan said. Yes. But you're not going to. No. Danny thought about this for a moment. Why not? Nathan looked at him. Of all the questions the room might have asked, this one was the most important, and it had come from the youngest person in it, which was either irony or accuracy. Nathan suspected it was accuracy. Because the value of a ranch isn't in the deed, he said. It's in the operation. And an operation is only as good as the people running it. He looked around the room. I've spent 5 weeks watching this operation from the inside. I know what it's worth, and I know what it's worth because of who's in it. Buying the deed and clearing the land would be taking the least valuable part and discarding the rest. Room was quiet for a moment. Prescott said, "What does this mean for wages?" "It means wages are current as of this month and stable going forward," Nathan said. "It means the operating debt is being restructured under terms that are sustainable rather than predatory. It means the cattle in the North Canyon are coming home." He paused. "It means the ranch survives." Another silence. Ruiz, who hadn't spoken in any meeting Nathan could remember, said quietly, "You worked beside us for 5 weeks." "Yes." "You fixed the grain storage. It needed fixing." Ruiz looked at him. "You fixed it because it needed fixing, not because you were going to tell us later you were the owner." "That's right. Ruiz nodded slowly, in the way of someone filing something away in a category that matters. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The meeting didn't end with cheers or handshakes or any of the things that happen in stories where the resolution is clean. It ended the way real resolutions end, with men sitting for a moment with complicated feelings, then getting up one by one and going back to work, because the work was there and the work still needed doing. And for men like these, the work continuing was itself a form of relief. Danny stopped on his way out and looked at Nathan. "What it's worth," he said. "You were a decent hand." Nathan looked at him. "Thank you, Danny. I mean it as a compliment." "I know you do." Danny went back to work. Nathan stood at the head of the empty table and felt the particular quiet of a room that has just processed something significant and moved on, which is not emptiness but the specific resonance of something real having happened in a specific place. Found Evelyn in the kitchen, where she usually was at that hour, except that she wasn't cooking. She was standing at the window looking out at the yard, and when Nathan came in she didn't turn around immediately, which told him she'd been thinking about something for a while and wasn't quite finished. He waited. "Did they take it all right?" she asked, still looking at the window. "As well as could be expected," he said. "Better than I deserved, in some ways." She turned then. She looked at him steadily, that look he'd come to know over 5 weeks, the one that meant she was seeing clearly and intended to say what she saw. "You're being hard on yourself." "I'm being accurate." "Those can be the same thing," she said. "Or they can be different things. It depends on whether the hardness is useful or whether it's just what you're used to." Nathan looked at her. "Is there a difference?" "I think so," she said. "Spent a lot of years being hard on myself about the mining company, about what I saw and didn't act on fast enough. It felt like accuracy. Felt like appropriate accountability." She turned back to the window for a moment, then back to him. "Eventually I understood that I was using it as a substitute for actually deciding what to do next. Self-criticism is very easy to confuse with self-knowledge." "Not the same." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "When did you figure that out?" "Somewhere between leaving that job and arriving here," she said. "Specifics are less important than the fact that the road between those two things was longer and harder than it needed to be." She paused. "I'm not recommending it." Nathan looked at her. There were things he wanted to say and was working out how to say them, which was unusual. For him, he was generally comfortable with the directness of language, had built a professional life on the precise deployment of words. But comfort with contractual language and comfort with the language of what is actually happening between two people are different competencies, and he was more practiced at one than the other. "I want you to stay," he said. It came out without the architecture he'd been building around it, which was probably better. Evelyn looked at him. She didn't look surprised, which meant she'd been thinking about this too, for some amount of time that he couldn't determine and suspected was comparable to his own. "Capacity," she said. "In whatever capacity you want," he said. "Mercer runs the day operations and he's good at it. But the broader management, the supply chain, the financial oversight, the things you identified in 3 weeks that took everyone else 14 months to miss, that needs someone who can see the whole picture. Someone who understands how operations fail from the inside." He paused. "I'd pay you what the work is worth, which is considerably more than what a cook earns." "I'm a good cook," she said. "You're a remarkable cook," he said. "You're also something considerably rarer." She held his gaze. Something in her expression was working through a series of considerations that she wasn't narrating, which was characteristic, and which he had learned to read the way you learn to read weather, not with certainty, but with increasing reliability. "You're not asking because of anything other than the work," she said, suspiciously checking. "I'm asking because of the work," he said. Stopped. Started again. "And because I'd like to see what this place becomes. I'd like to see it with someone who cares about it for the same reasons I do." Turns out to be a shorter list of people than I'd have guessed when I rode in here 5 weeks ago. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. "The room off the kitchen is too small," she said. "We can fix that. I want a real office, with a proper desk and a window that faces east." "East," Nathan said. "Morning light," she said simply. "I think better in morning light." "Done," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned back to the stove, because something on it needed attention, and she addressed it with the same unhurried efficiency she brought to everything. "Send Croft away today," she said while she worked. "He makes the younger hands nervous, and he's finished what he came to do." "Leaves this afternoon," Nathan said. "Good." She adjusted something on the stove. "Talk to Vale before the marshal comes for him." Nathan paused. "Why?" Because he made a bad choice under impossible pressure and then made a better one when it mattered, she said. And because he's going to spend some time accounting for the first choice, and how he carries that depends partly on whether anyone saw the second one clearly. She looked over her shoulder at him. You saw it. Tell him so. Nathan stood in the kitchen doorway and thought about the specific quality of Evelyn Hartwell, not her competence, which was formidable, not her intelligence, which was sharper than most, but the thing underneath those things. Particular moral clarity she carried without making a performance of it. Kind of clarity that comes from having been in difficult positions and having thought carefully about them rather than simply surviving them. All right, he said. And Nathan, he stopped. The desk, she said. East-facing window, don't forget. I won't forget, he said. He talked to Vale that evening. Vale was in the bunkhouse Croft had, in fact, left that afternoon, riding out with the same unremarkable efficiency he'd arrived with, and Vale was sitting on his bunk, with his hands loosely clasped between his knees and the look of a man who has reconciled himself to. Waiting and is doing it as cleanly as he can manage. Nathan sat down on the bunk across from him. The marshal comes tomorrow, Nathan said. I know, Vale said. Your attorney should be here by morning. One Aldrich arranged. Vale nodded. He'd been informed of this. He hadn't asked for it, which Nathan had noted, and which had factored into the conversation he was about to have. I want to tell you something, Nathan said. Not as the man who holds the debt or the man who built the case. Just as someone who watched what happened in that office 2 nights ago. Vale looked at him. What you did in that room, Nathan said. Choice you made. That was real. It cost you something real, and you did it anyway, and I want you to know that it was seen. Vale was quiet for a moment. His jaw moved slightly, the way a jaw moves when a person is managing what their face does. Doesn't undo the rest of it, Vale said. No, Nathan said. Doesn't. Then what does it do? Nathan thought about how to answer this honestly. Makes the rest of it more complicated than a simple story about a man who did wrong things, he said. And complicated is closer to true, which matters even when it doesn't change the practical outcome. Vale looked at his hands. I think about the men in this bunkhouse, he said. Ones who are here because they've got nowhere better. I told myself for a long time that what I was doing was, he stopped. There's no version of what I did that holds up when I say it out loud. I know that. The pressure Halston put you under was real, Nathan said. Lots of people have real pressure and don't do what I did. Yes, Nathan said, that's true. Vale looked at him. The honesty of that answer seemed to do something unexpected, not wound him, but settle him, the way accurate things sometimes settle people better than kind ones do. You're not going to tell me it wasn't my fault. No. Good. He paused. I couldn't have stood that. Nathan sat with him for another few minutes, not talking, in the particular companionable quiet of men who have said the things that needed saying and don't have anything to add that would improve on the silence. When Nathan stood to leave, Vale said, the ranch. Will it be all right? Yes, Nathan said. It will. Vale nodded. He looked at the bunkhouse floor. Good, he said quietly. That's good. Nathan went back out into the evening air and stood in the yard for a while, looking up at the sky, which was doing what western skies do in the last light of the day, going through colors that don't have adequate names. Kind of display that makes a person feel simultaneously very small and very specifically located in the world, which is not always a bad feeling. The marshal arrived the following morning with 2 deputies and the professional gravity of someone who has been briefed and understands what he's been briefed on. Spoke with Nathan and Croft and reviewed the documents. Then he spoke with Vale in the presence of Vale's attorney, and the process ground forward with the slow, legitimate momentum of legal machinery doing what it's designed to do. Halston's attorneys contacted Nathan's office within the 3-day window. Withdrawal of the default notice was filed before the week was out. The accounting of the fraudulent vendor payments. When it came, revealed a total of $6,300 extracted from Blackthorn Ridge over 14 months more than Nathan's earlier estimate, less than the damage it had done to the ranch's viability. Because the real damage had not been in the dollars, but in the manufactured crisis of confidence that had made everyone from the crew to the creditors believe the place was dying when it wasn't. 23 head of cattle came back from the North Canyon on a Tuesday, driven in by Mercer and Ruiz and 2 other hands in the early morning. And when they came through the gate, Danny counted them aloud, not because anyone needed the count announced, because he was 19, and some things call for acknowledgement, and Mercer, riding behind the last of them, allowed himself a look that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the family of smiles, The kind that arrives on the face of a man who has been waiting a long time for something that has finally actually arrived. Nathan watched from the corral fence. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window. Their eyes met across the yard for a moment, in the way of two people who are on opposite sides of the same experience and know it without needing to discuss it. 3 months passed. The specific quality of 3 months on a working ranch is that they are full, not full in the way of overcrowded calendars, but full in the way of consistent purpose, of each day having its clear shape and its clear demands, problems arriving in sizes that human hands can address. Cattle herd was restocked. The supply agreements were renegotiated under legitimate terms with actual vendors who existed at actual addresses. Water pumped behind the barn, which Nathan had fixed on his first real week, continued to work, which was the smallest and somehow the most satisfying ongoing evidence that some things, once fixed, stay fixed. East-facing office with the proper desk was built in November, in the addition to the main house that Mercer had been meaning to construct for years, and that now had a specific reason to be constructed before winter. Evelyn moved into it with her ledgers and her columns of figures and her habit of working in the morning light, and the first week she sat at that desk, she found 3 additional irregularities in the pre-crisis accounts that nobody had caught, and she documented them and brought them to Nathan, and Nathan forwarded the documentation to Aldrich in the Capitol, and Aldrich added it to the growing file on Halston's operation. Halston's legal situation as winter arrived was substantial. Territorial Marshal's investigation had expanded beyond Blackthorn Ridge when it became clear that the operating methods documented in the case matched the circumstances of 2 other ranches that had transferred ownership under pressure in the previous 4 years. Nathan had suspected this. He hadn't said so to anyone except Croft, who had nodded with the expression of a man who had suspected it independently. Vail received his accounting before the territorial court in December. Cooperation he'd provided, combined with Mercer's testimony, which was measured, factual, and included a clear account of the coercive circumstances, without being lenient about what Vail had done, resulted in an outcome that was neither light nor crushing. He would serve time. He would make restitution. When it was done, he would have the specific kind of future that belongs to people who have carried a heavy thing and put it down in the right place at significant cost to themselves. Nathan thought about Vail, occasionally not obsessively, not with ongoing guilt, but with the steady low-grade awareness of someone who has seen a person make a hard choice in a hard moment and filed it in the category of things worth remembering. Category was not large. It was not the category of triumphs or victories or clean outcomes. It was the category of moments that tell you something true about human beings, which is that they are not simple, and not always redeemable, and not always beyond redemption. And the difference between those last 2 things is usually a question of what happens in one particular moment under one particular kind of pressure. On the last day of the year, Nathan rode the perimeter of Blackthorn Ridge. Did it alone, starting before sunrise, following the fence line from the main gate south and then east and then north, the full circuit of the ranch's declared boundaries. It took most of the day. Stopped twice once at the north fence line where it came closest to the box canyon, which was now empty and had been empty for 3 months, and once at the highest point of the eastern boundary, where the land rose into a low ridge that gave a view of the full spread of the ranch below. Up from that ridge, in the thin December light, Blackthorn Ridge looked like what it was, a working place. Not beautiful in the way of paintings or postcards too worn for that, too marked by use and weather and the particular unprettiness of genuine labor. But functional in the way of something that has been maintained with care, that has people in it who know what they're doing, that has survived the specific crisis that was designed to destroy it and come out the other side still standing. Nathan sat his horse on the ridge and looked at it for a long time. Thought about the canvas duffel bag and the worn hat and the deliberate choice to arrive as nobody. People had questioned that choice. Mercer had questioned it. Evelyn had questioned it. Nathan had questioned it himself in the long stretches of the middle weeks, when carrying both the knowledge and the concealment had felt like walking with weight on both shoulders. He still thought the choice had been necessary. He also still thought it had cost more than he'd budgeted for it, in ways that couldn't be measured in practical terms. What he'd learned from inside the specific texture of what it felt like to be one of the people working a place that was being dismantled around them without their knowing was something he couldn't have learned any other way. He knew that. It had been worth knowing. But the thing he hadn't anticipated and couldn't have anticipated was what he'd find inside along with everything else. He'd come looking for information. He'd come to assess viability, to determine whether the thing at the center of the crisis was worth the cost of addressing the crisis. These were rational, defensible, professionally sound objectives. Found all of that. He'd also found Mercer, who extended trust carefully and maintained it stubbornly, and whose version of loyalty was so embedded in his daily behavior that it barely looked like a virtue anymore, and more like a structural feature of how he moved through the world. He'd found Danny, who asked direct questions and accepted direct answers, and was going to become, Nathan thought, the kind of man that a place like this specifically needed and could not manufacture from nothing. He'd found the particular crew of people who had stayed in a crisis not because they had nowhere to go, some of them did, probably, but because staying felt like the right thing, and they were the kind of people who let that feeling make decisions for them. And he had found Evelyn, who had arrived with her one bag and her history with the mining company, and her habit of turning papers face down when she didn't yet know who was in the room, and who had spent 5 weeks being, without announcement or performance, the most genuinely useful person in a situation that was badly in need of useful people. There is something that happens to a person who has operated for a long time at the level of resources and authority that Nathan Cole operated at, which is that the human scale of things becomes increasingly theoretical. Not because such a person becomes callous. Nathan had never been callous, but because the decisions made at that altitude are about systems and structures and aggregate effects, and the people inside those systems become a kind of arithmetic. Important arithmetic. But arithmetic. Blackthorn Ridge had done
what the canvas duffel bag and the worn hat and 35 days of fence mending and cattle counting had done was return him to the scale of specific people in a specific place, making specific choices.
And the weight of those choices experienced up close rather than observed from a distance. Thought that was probably the thing he'd needed most and known least that he needed. He turned his horse back toward the ranch and rode down from the ridge into the last of the day's light. Evelyn was in the kitchen when he came in, which was where she often was in the early evening. Not because the kitchen was her domain, but because she thought well while her hands were occupied, and the kitchen consistently provided her hands with occupation. Gutta. She looked up when he came in and then looked at him more carefully, the way she did when she was reading something in his face that he wasn't aware of putting there. Rode the whole perimeter, she said. How do you know? You look like a man who's been out all day and has arrived at a conclusion, she said. You only ride the perimeter when you're trying to think something through to the end. Nathan pulled a chair to the kitchen table and sat down. I've only ridden it twice. Twice is enough to establish a pattern, she said. What's the conclusion? He looked at her. She was standing at the work table with flour on her hands and a practical apron, and her hair slightly escaping the arrangement she'd put it in that morning, and she looked entirely like herself, which was the thing he'd come to value most about her presence, the specific consistency of it. The fact that Evelyn Hartwell looked the same, whether she was in a room with the territorial marshal or a room with a hired hand. Sameness was not a performance of equality, but an actual indifference to the hierarchy of moments. I want to stay, he said. She looked at him. You own the ranch. You were always going to stay. I want to stay the way I stayed these last 3 months, he said. Not managing it from the capital. Not reviewing reports. Here. Working this, he paused. I've been thinking about what that would look like practically. And I think it looks like this, he said, which is what it's looked like for the past 12 weeks, minus the legal crisis. Evelyn looked at him steadily. Her expression was working through something not resistant, not cautious, but thoughtful in the particular way that meant she was taking the thing seriously enough to look at all its sides before she responded. You have other operations, she said. I do. Aldrich handles most of the legal side. Croft handles the investigative side when it's needed. I've been managing the financial oversight remotely for years. There's nothing that requires me to be somewhere else. He met her eyes. There's nothing pulling me away from here except habit. Habits are hard, she said. Some are, he said. Some just feel hard because you've never tested whether you could put them down. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said the East office needs a second desk. Nathan looked at her. If you're going to be doing the financial management from here, she said, with the particular composure of someone who is saying a practical thing and meaning a much larger thing and trusting the other person to understand both at once, you'll need somewhere to work. I won't have you at my desk. I worked for that view. Absolutely did, Nathan said. A second desk, she said. West-facing, So we're not competing for the light. It almost said something about why west-facing specifically. And then he understood that she had chosen west-facing because it would put them facing each other across the room, and that this was not an accident, and that Evelyn rarely did anything that was an accident. West-facing, he said. Done. She turned back to the work table, and he sat at the kitchen table. And outside the window, the last of the winter daylight was leaving the sky in the slow way it leaves. On the ranch was settling into its evening sounds: the horses, closing of the barn door, the voices of the crew coming in from the day's last work. This was the thing nobody told you about saving something, Nathan thought. Not the documents and the legal filings and the confrontation in the office with the man in the dark coat. Not the moment the cattle came back through the gate. Not the moment Halston's attorneys filed the withdrawal. The thing nobody told you was this: ordinary evening, after the crisis is over, when the place is simply a place and the people in it are simply people, going about the business of continuing, that this was the thing that had been worth saving all along. Not the crisis resolved, the evening that follows. Particular quality of a life being lived in a specific place by specific people who have decided, for their own reasons and at their own cost, that the place is worth their continued effort. Nathan had spent 35 days pretending to be nobody, and in doing so had found, unexpectedly, the thing that wealthy men most often lose: the experience of a moment that had nothing to recommend it except that it was real, and that he was in it, and that the people around him were worth being around. Canvas duffel was still in the corner of the room he slept in. He hadn't put it away. He didn't think he was going to. Some reminders were worth keeping close.